The night Sheriff Clayton set his sights on destroying her, Abigail Foster learned that salvation sometimes arrives in the form of a stranger with dusty boots and unflinching eyes. One dance, one lie, one man brave enough to stand between a predator and his prey. This is the story of a woman who thought she'd face ruin alone until a cowboy walked through those doors and changed everything with two simple words. She's taken. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The spring of 1875 arrived in Silver Creek the way it always did, with mud-thick roads, the scent of new grass pushing through winter-hard earth, and the annual spring social that set the entire town buzzing with anticipation. For most folks, it meant new dresses, polished boots, and the promise of music floating through the community hall until the small hours of morning. For Abigail Foster, it meant something else entirely. Another night of standing against the wall while life happened to everyone but her. She stood there now, in the corner near the refreshment table, her mother's cream-colored dress altered to fit her taller frame, her dark hair pinned back in a style that had taken her an hour to achieve and would likely be disheveled within another. The dance card dangling from her wrist remained pristinely blank, a small rectangle of humiliation she couldn't quite bring herself to remove. Around her, Silver Creek's finest swirled and laughed. Martha Henderson giggled as young Thomas Wright nearly tripped over his own feet, trying to lead her through a reel. The Calloway sisters, both blonde and both relentlessly cheerful, had filled their cards before the music even began. Even old Mrs. Patterson was out on the floor, her husband of 40 years guiding her through the steps they'd known since they were young. Abigail watched it all with the practiced expression of someone who'd learned not to let her loneliness show. She was 23 years old, owned a struggling horse ranch on the outskirts of town, and carried debts that would have broken a weaker person months ago. She was, by Silver Creek standards, unmarriageable, poor, proud, and far too independent for her own good. "Miss Foster." The voice cut through her thoughts like a knife through butter, smooth, cold, and entirely unwelcome. She turned to find Sheriff Clayton approaching, his badge catching the lamplight, his smile catching nothing but her immediate dread. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and handsome in the way that poisonous things are often beautiful. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, his suit pressed to perfection, and his eyes held the kind of calculation that made smart women cross to the other side of the street. "Sheriff." She kept her voice neutral, her back straight. She'd learned early that showing fear to men like Clayton was like showing blood to wolves. "I notice your card is empty." He didn't ask. He observed, stated, claimed. His gaze swept over her with the possessive quality of a man appraising livestock. "I thought I might remedy that situation." Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. Clayton had been circling her property for months, making comments about how difficult it must be for a woman alone to manage such a large ranch, offering to help in ways that always seemed to benefit him more than her. He wanted her land. He wanted her horses. And lately, his visits had suggested he wanted something more. "That's kind of you, Sheriff, but It wasn't a question, Miss Foster." His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. He reached for her wrist, fingers closing around the ribbon that held her dance card. "A woman in your position should be grateful for any—" The doors to the community hall swung open with a force that stopped conversations mid-sentence and turned heads across the room. The spring wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and the vast open spaces beyond Silver Creek's carefully cultivated borders. And in that doorway stood a man who looked like he'd ridden straight out of a dime novel. He was tall, taller even than Clayton, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and a frame that spoke of harder living. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, his boots dusty from the trail, his hat tipped back just enough to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind and whatever else life on the frontier threw at a man. But it was his eyes that caught Abigail's attention and held it. Blue, clear, and looking directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The stranger stepped into the lamplight, his spurs chiming softly against the wooden floor. The musicians had stopped playing. The dancers had stopped dancing. Every soul in that room watched as this unknown cowboy walked forward with the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He stopped 3 feet from where Abigail stood, trapped by Clayton's grip on her wrist. His gaze flicked to the sheriff's hand, then back to Abigail's face, and something in his expression shifted, hardened, in a way that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "She's taken." 2 words, spoken quietly, calmly, with the absolute certainty of a man stating an irrefutable fact. 2 words that somehow managed to be both a declaration and a warning. Clayton's fingers tightened on Abigail's wrist. "Excuse me?" The stranger's eyes never left Abigail's face. "The lady. She's taken. Her card is full." He paused, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "With me." The silence that followed was profound. Abigail could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on this moment. No one spoke to Sheriff Clayton that way. No one challenged him, contradicted him, or stood between him and what he wanted. Until now. Clayton released her wrist and turned to face the stranger fully, his hand resting with deliberate casualness near the gun at his hip. "And who exactly are you?" "Frank Walker." The stranger, Frank, extended his hand not to Clayton, but to Abigail. "Old friend of the family. I was sorry to hear about your father, Miss Foster. He was a good man." Abigail's mind raced. She'd never seen this man before in her life, didn't know a Frank Walker from Adam, but she knew opportunity when it arrived on dusty boots and desperate timing. She knew that Clayton's fingers had left marks on her wrist that would purple by morning, and she knew, with sudden crystalline clarity, that whatever game this stranger was playing, it was a better bet than the one Clayton had in mind. She placed her hand in Frank's. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. "Mr. Walker, what a surprise!" Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "I didn't know you were in town." "Just arrived." His fingers closed gently around hers. Nothing like Clayton's grip, everything like a lifeline. "Heard about the social and thought I'd pay my respects. Your father spoke of you often. I promised him, if I was ever in Silver Creek, I'd look in on you." He glanced at Clayton, his expression pleasant, but his eyes hard as flint. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Clayton's jaw worked like he was chewing through leather. "Miss Foster and I were just about to dance." "Were you?" Frank's tone suggested polite interest and absolute disbelief in equal measure. He turned to Abigail, still holding her hand, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles in what might have been reassurance, or might have been asking permission, or might have been both. "Is that true, Miss Foster?" Every eye in Silver Creek was on her. Martha Henderson had her hand over her mouth. The Calloway sisters were whispering furiously to each other. Old Mrs. Patterson looked like Christmas had come early. And Clayton looked like a man watching his prey slip through his fingers and trying to decide whether to let it go or tighten his grip until something broke. Abigail lifted her chin and met Frank Walker's impossibly blue eyes. "Actually, Mr. Walker, I believe I promised you the first dance, and the second, and—" She paused, feeling reckless, feeling free, feeling like maybe this one time she could choose her own path instead of having it chosen for her. "And possibly the rest of the evening." The smile that broke across Frank's face was like sunrise, slow, warm, and transforming. "Then I'm the luckiest man in the territory." He offered her his arm. She took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. Together they walked past Clayton, past the gaping townspeople, past every expectation and assumption that had ever been made about lonely Abigail Foster and her blank dance card. Behind them, Clayton's voice was low and dangerous. "I'll want to have a word with you later, Walker, about your business in Silver Creek." Frank didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly across the room. "I'll be at the Foster Ranch. You know where to find me." Then they were in the center of the floor, and the musicians, bless them, were striking up a waltz, and Frank's hand was settling at her waist with a respect that Clayton had never shown, and Abigail was moving through the steps her mother had taught her years ago, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't standing alone against the wall watching life happen to other people. "You're going to have to tell me," she whispered as they turned, "why you just lied to an entire room full of people and made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the county." Frank's hand tightened slightly at her waist, steadying her through a turn. "I'll tell you, but first, are you all right? Did he hurt you?" The question surprised her. Most men in Silver Creek didn't ask if she was all right. They told her she would be, if she'd just do what they said, marry who they suggested, sell what they wanted to buy. My wrist will bruise, but I've had worse. Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, she thought, but not at her. You shouldn't have to have worse, any of it. It's been a difficult year. She didn't know why she was telling him this. Maybe because he was a stranger and strangers couldn't judge what they didn't know. Maybe because his hand at her waist felt safe, in a way nothing had felt safe since her father died. Since my father passed, the debts have been substantial, and certain people have been very interested in helping me resolve them, by helping themselves to your land. Yes, she met his gaze directly. So I'll ask again, Mr. Walker, why did you lie for me? He guided her through another turn, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man who looked like he spent more time on horseback than on dance floors. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. Because I've been that man before. The one watching a predator circle someone who doesn't deserve what's coming. And because I was taught that when you see someone cornered, you don't walk past. You step in. Even for a stranger? Especially for a stranger. The music swelled around them. Across the room, Clayton stood with his arms crossed, watching them with eyes that promised consequences. But Frank didn't look at him. He looked at Abigail, and his expression was serious, honest, and utterly without guile. I didn't know your father, Miss Foster. That was a lie. But I'd tell it again, right now, without hesitation, if it meant keeping a wolf from cornering a lady who deserves better. Her throat tightened. You don't know me either. You don't know if I deserve anything. I know you're standing in the middle of a dance floor talking to a stranger about debts and predators when you should be thinking about nothing heavier than music. He smiled, and it was the saddest, warmest smile she'd ever seen. I know your wrist is going to bruise from where he grabbed you. I know every person in this room watched you stand alone for probably an hour before I walked in. And I know that when I gave you a choice, to go along with my lie or call me out on it, you chose the risk of trusting a stranger over the certainty of whatever Clayton had planned. The waltz was ending. Another would begin soon. Abigail could feel the weight of 100 conversations that would happen tomorrow. 100 speculations about the mysterious Frank Walker and his connection to the Foster family. She should care about that, should worry about her reputation, her standing, the whispers that would follow. But standing here in the lamplight, with this stranger's hand steady at her waist, and his eyes holding secrets she suddenly wanted to know, she found she couldn't make herself care about any of it. The rest of the evening, she said softly. I told Clayton you had my card for the rest of the evening. You did. Frank's thumb brushed her waist through the fabric of her dress, a touch so light she might have imagined it. Are you sure? Because I can walk out that door right now if you'd rather not be tied to whatever trouble I just caused. She should let him go, should thank him for the rescue and send him on his way before Clayton's suspicions turned into something more dangerous. Should protect what little she had left instead of risking it on a blue-eyed stranger who'd walked into her life with lies and promises he might not keep. Should. Abigail Foster had spent the last year doing what she should, being sensible, being careful, being alone. I'm sure, she said, and felt something inside her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day they'd buried her father, crack open just a little. Dance with me, Mr. Walker, at least until the music stops. His smile was answer enough. Frank, and I'll dance with you as long as you'll have me, Miss Foster. Abigail. The name felt like a gift, offered freely. If we're going to scandalize the town together, we might as well be on a first-name basis. The music started again. A reel this time, faster and more complicated than the waltz. Around them, other couples joined the floor, their movements creating patterns of color and motion. But Abigail barely noticed. She was too busy learning the rhythm of dancing with someone who moved like he was born. Understanding how to lead without controlling, how to guide without forcing, how to make a partner feel safe, even in the middle of chaos. They danced through the reel, then a Scottish, then another waltz. Between dances, Frank fetched her punch and positioned himself between her and Clayton's glowering presence near the door. They talked. About nothing, about everything. About the weather and the trail and whether she preferred horses to cattle. Horses, always horses, was her answer, and his grin suggested he'd known it before he asked. "Where are you from?" she asked during a pause in the music, breathless from dancing and something else she couldn't quite name. "Everywhere." He handed her a cup of punch, his fingers careful not to touch the bruises forming on her wrist. "Nowhere. I've been working ranches since I was 14, cattle drives mostly. Worked my way from Texas to Montana and back again. And you just happened to be passing through Silver Creek on the night of our social?" His eyes crinkled at the corners. "I heard there might be good horses in the area. Heard the Foster Ranch had some of the finest stock in the territory." He paused. "Heard the owner might be in need of a good hand if she was hiring." Abigail's breath caught. "That's what this is? You're looking for work?" "I'm looking for a lot of things." His voice dropped, became something more serious, more real. "But yes, I heard Silver Creek had a horse ranch run by a woman who knew her business, who'd learned from one of the best trainers in the West, who was trying to keep her father's legacy alive despite some powerful people wanting to see her fail." He met her gaze directly. "I heard she might need help, and I needed a reason to stop moving for a while." "Who told you all that?" "Bar in Cheyenne. Cowboys talk. Your father's reputation reached farther than you might think." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this stranger with his easy smile and his protective instincts and his impeccable timing was exactly what he seemed. A drifter looking for honest work who'd happened to arrive at the exact moment she needed someone to stand between her and disaster. But Abigail Foster hadn't survived the last year by being naive. "And the part where you claimed to be an old family friend, where you said my father spoke of me often." Frank had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Pure invention. I'm sorry for that. But when I walked in and saw Clayton putting his hands on you, saw the look on your face." He shook his head. "I didn't stop to think of a better story. I just knew I needed to give you a way out that wouldn't make you look desperate or make him look rejected. Family friend was the first thing that came to mind." It was a good lie. She sipped her punch, studying him over the rim of the cup. "Quick thinking, but it's going to cause problems. Clayton will check. He'll ask around, try to verify your story." "Let him." Frank's expression hardened. "I've got nothing to hide. And if he wants to come after me for helping a lady in distress, that says more about him than it does about me." The music was winding down. Through the windows, Abigail could see the night sky scattered with stars, could see the dark shapes of horses and wagons waiting to carry people home. The social was ending. Real life was waiting. "I should go," she said, but didn't move. "I'll walk you to your wagon." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. Just an offer, made simply, that she could accept or refuse as she chose. She should refuse, should protect her reputation, avoid giving the town more to talk about than they already would have, should put distance between herself and this compelling stranger before she did something foolish like trust him. But Clayton was still watching from across the room, his eyes promising consequences, and the thought of walking out into the dark alone with him somewhere behind her made Abigail's skin crawl. "All right." She set down her cup. "Thank you." They collected her shawl, a thin thing that had been her mother's, worn soft with age and memories. Frank draped it over her shoulders with the kind of care usually reserved for something infinitely more precious. Together they walked out into the spring night, leaving behind the warm glow of the community hall and the weight of 100 speculating stares. Outside, the air was cool and clean, washed with the scent of prairie grass and distant pine. Abigail's wagon waited where she'd left it, her horse, a reliable bay mare named Duchess, dozing in the traces. The street was filling with people saying their goodbyes, laughing about the evening's events, making plans for the week ahead. And watching them from the steps of the community hall, his expression unreadable in the lamplight spilling from the doorway, stood Sheriff Clayton. Frank's hand settled at the small of her back, not pushing, just present, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "Ignore him. He's trying to intimidate you." "It's working." She managed a smile, trying to lighten the moment. "I'm thoroughly intimidated." "No, you're not." His voice held conviction. "You're worried, which is smart, but you're not intimidated. If you were intimidated, you'd have danced with him tonight. You'd have given in. You didn't." They reached her wagon. Frank checked Duchess's traces with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent his life around horses, then offered his hand to help Abigail up. She took it, felt his strength steady her as she climbed onto the seat, felt his warmth even after he'd released her hand, and stepped back. "You said you'd be at the Foster Ranch," she said, gathering the reins, "when Clayton wanted to talk to you later. Did you mean that?" Frank tilted his head back, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Did you mean it when you said I had your card for the rest of the evening?" "Yes." The word came out before she could think better of it. "But the evening is over. Then maybe tomorrow could be the start of a new one." He rested his hand on the side of the wagon, casual, like he belonged there, like this moment was as natural as breathing. "I wasn't lying about looking for work, Abigail. If you're hiring, I'd like to be considered. And if you're not hiring—" He paused, his expression turning serious. "Clayton's not going to let tonight go. He's going to come after you, try to make you pay for the embarrassment. You shouldn't face that alone." Every practical bone in her body screamed that this was a terrible idea. She didn't know this man, didn't know if his story was true or invented, didn't know if his intentions were honorable or if he was just another vulture circling her struggling ranch with his own agenda. But she knew how her wrist ached where Clayton had grabbed her, knew how it felt to stand alone in a crowded room with nowhere to turn and no one to trust, knew that sometimes salvation came in unexpected packages, and sometimes you had to take a leap of faith or drown in the staying still. "Dawn," she said, making the decision even as doubt whispered warnings. "If you're serious about work, come at dawn. We'll talk then." His smile was slow and real, reaching all the way to those impossibly blue eyes. "Dawn it is." He stepped back from the wagon, touched the brim of his hat. "Get home safe, Abigail Foster, and lock your doors tonight." "Because of Clayton?" "Because the world's full of wolves." His expression turned grim. "And not all of them wear badges." She flicked the reins, and Duchess started forward, pulling the wagon away from the community hall and the lamplight, and the man with the blue eyes who'd called her, taken when she'd been anything but. As they rolled down the main street toward the road that led home, Abigail glanced back once. Frank Walker stood where she'd left him, a dark silhouette against the lights of town, watching her go. And on the steps of the community hall, also watching, stood Sheriff Clayton. The ride home was 3 miles of darkness and stars and thoughts that tumbled over each other like creek water over stones. Abigail's ranch sat on good land north of town, with grazing that stayed green longer than most, and water rights that her father had fought to secure. The house was simple but solid. 2 stories, built from lumber hauled all the way from Denver, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and a view that stretched for miles. It had been her father's pride. Now it was her burden. She stabled Duchess, checking the mare's feed and water with the automatic movements of someone who'd done these tasks 1,000 times. The barn was quiet, populated by the 6 horses she'd managed to keep after selling off stock to pay debts. 6 horses where there used to be 30. 6 animals that represented everything she had left. In the house, she lit a lamp and stood in the kitchen. Her mother had loved, looking at the stack of papers on the table that represented her father's legacy, debts, liens, notices from the bank. Sheriff Clayton had offered to help with those debts, offered to marry her, take over the ranch, solve all her problems. All she had to do was give up everything her father had built and make herself property of a man who looked at her like she was already his. "No," the word echoed in the empty kitchen. "Not while I'm still breathing." She touched her wrist where the bruises were darkening, then touched her waist where Frank Walker's hand had rested during their dance, respectful, steady, asking nothing, offering everything. One dance, one lie. One stranger who'd stepped between her and disaster without knowing her name. And tomorrow, at dawn, he'd be back. Abigail climbed the stairs to her bedroom, shed her mother's cream-colored dress, and fell into bed with her mind spinning and her heart racing, and something that felt dangerously close to hope taking root beneath her ribs. Outside her window, the prairie stretched vast and dark beneath a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, Frank Walker was bedding down for the night, probably in the livery stable or under the stars themselves. And somewhere closer, Sheriff Clayton was making plans that certainly didn't include letting this evening's humiliation go unanswered. But for the first time since her father's death, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Abigail Foster fell asleep not with dread coiling in her stomach, but with a spark of anticipation warming her chest. Tomorrow. Dawn. Whatever came next. She'd face it the way she'd faced everything else, standing tall, holding steady, refusing to break. But maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that promised a beautiful day. Abigail had been awake for an hour already, moving through her morning routine with hands that wouldn't stay steady and a mind that wouldn't stop replaying the previous night. She'd changed her dress 3 times before settling on her usual work clothes, a simple cotton blouse and split riding skirt that her father had commissioned for her years ago, back when he'd still been teaching her everything he knew about horses, and hadn't yet been taken by the fever that swept through Silver Creek one brutal winter. She was mucking out the stalls when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Her heart jumped, then steadied. It was probably Frank Walker arriving as promised. Or it was Sheriff Clayton coming to make good on the threat that had lived in his eyes all last night. Either way, standing in a horse stall with a pitchfork wasn't going to change what came next. Abigail set down her tools, brushed straw from her skirt, and walked out into the morning light just as a rider crested the rise that led to her property. Frank Walker sat easy in the saddle on a rangy buckskin gelding that looked like it had covered a lot of hard miles and still had plenty left to give. In the daylight, without the lamplight, and music and desperate circumstances of the social, he looked even more like what he'd claimed to be, a working cowboy, all lean muscle and sun-weathered skin, and the kind of quiet competence that came from surviving on your own wits and will. He reined in his horse at the edge of her yard, waiting. Not presuming, not pushing, just waiting for her invitation to approach. Something about that simple courtesy made Abigail's throat tight. She stepped forward, raising one hand in greeting. "You came." "Said I would." He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd been climbing on and off horses since before he could walk. "Hope I'm not too early. Sun's barely up." "I've been awake since 4. She gestured toward the barn. "There's coffee in the house if you want it, or we can talk out here." Frank glanced toward the house, then back at the barn, his gaze taking in the neat fencing, the well-maintained structures, the evidence of someone who knew how to run a ranch and took pride in doing it right. "Out here's fine, unless you'd rather—" "Out here." She cut him off gently. Having him in her house felt too intimate, too presumptuous for whatever this was. The barn was neutral ground. "Let me show you around." She led him through the property, pointing out the 6 horses that remained, explaining their bloodlines and their quirks and their potential. Frank listened with the attention of someone who actually cared about what he was hearing, asking questions that proved he knew horseflesh, nodding at her explanations, occasionally moving closer to examine a particular animal's conformation or temperament. "Your father trained them?" he asked, running an experienced hand down the leg of a 3-year-old mare that Abigail had been working with for months. "Most of them. This one's all mine." Pride crept into her voice despite her efforts to keep it neutral. "Luna, she's got her mother's speed and her father's disposition. Should be worth good money if I can finish her training." "If?" Frank straightened, his blue eyes sharp. "You sound like you're not sure you'll get the chance." Abigail's jaw tightened. "The bank wants payment by September. I've got 4 months to come up with more money than I've seen in 2 years. These horses are my best shot, but they're not ready yet. And training takes time I might not have." "What about selling the land?" "To who? Clayton?" The name came out bitter. "He's made it clear he's interested, but his offer is half what this place is worth, and it comes with conditions I won't accept." Frank's expression darkened. "Let me guess. Marriage." "Among other things." She moved away from Luna, uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. "Look, Mr. Walker." "Frank." "Frank." The name still felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for someone she'd just met. "I appreciate what you did last night, truly. But if you're here because you feel some kind of obligation or because you think I'm some damsel who needs rescuing, you can turn that horse around and ride back to wherever you came from. I've been managing on my own for nearly a year, and I'll keep managing until what?" His voice was quiet but held an edge. Until Clayton finds a legal way to take this place? Until you work yourself into the ground trying to do the work of 3 men alone? Until something happens that you can't handle by yourself and there's no one here to help? That's my business. It became my business the moment I stepped between you and him. Frank moved closer, not crowding but present, demanding her attention. You think Clayton's going to let last night go? You embarrassed him in front of the whole town. Men like that don't forgive. They get even. I know that. Her hands clenched at her sides. Why do you think I've been awake since 4? I know exactly what's coming. I just don't know when. Then let me help. The intensity in his voice made her look up, meet those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses. I wasn't lying about needing work. I've been on the trail for 3 years, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. I'm tired of it. Tired of running. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face before his expression settled back into determination. I want to stop moving. Want to put down roots somewhere that matters. Your ranch, what you're trying to do here, it matters. Let me help you save it. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to refuse. She didn't know this man. Didn't know what he was running from or why he'd really chosen her ranch out of all the places he could have stopped. Didn't know if his offer came from genuine desire to help or from some ulterior motive she couldn't see yet. But she also didn't know how she was going to train 6 horses, maintain a ranch, keep the bank satisfied, and fend off Clayton's increasingly aggressive attempts to force her hand. Didn't know how much longer she could keep going alone before something broke, the ranch or her. I can't pay much. The words came out before she could stop them, before caution could override desperation. Room and board, and a small wage. That's all I can offer until I sell some stock. Frank's smile was slow and genuine. Room and board's more than I've had in months. The wage can wait until you're back on your feet. That's not fair to you. Fair would be Clayton backing off and the bank giving you time to breathe. Fair would be this town recognizing that you're doing something remarkable here and supporting you instead of circling like vultures. His voice gentled. I'm not looking for fair, Abigail. I'm looking for purpose. For work that means something. For a reason to stay in one place long enough to remember what that feels like. She wanted to ask what he was running from, wanted to demand references, verify his story, protect herself from making a mistake that could cost her everything. But time was a luxury she didn't have, and pride was a burden she couldn't afford. 2 weeks. She held up her hand before he could respond. 2 weeks trial. You work, I'll watch. If it doesn't work out, you ride away, no hard feelings. If it does, she let the sentence hang, not ready to commit to anything beyond the immediate future. 2 weeks. Frank extended his hand. You won't regret this. She took his hand, felt the calluses that proved his claims of hard work, felt the steady grip that spoke of reliability and strength. I hope not. Because if I do, it won't just be my ranch that suffers. It'll be my pride, my judgment, and possibly my life if Clayton decides to make this personal. Then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance. Frank released her hand but held her gaze. Where do you want me to start? They worked through the morning side by side, Frank proving with every action that he knew his way around a ranch. He fixed the gate that had been sticking for weeks, reinforced the fence line in the north pasture, and handled the horses with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of experience. They didn't talk much, just the necessary communication of people working toward a common goal. But the silence was comfortable, companionable, nothing like the heavy solitude that had weighed on Abigail for months. Around noon, she called a break, and they settled on the porch with cold chicken and bread left from yesterday's baking. Frank ate with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted, while Abigail found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved, the set of his shoulders, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she wondered about but didn't ask. You're good with the horses, she said finally, breaking the silence. Better than most hands I've seen. Frank swallowed, reached for his water. Learned young. My father worked cattle, but my uncle trained horses. Spent summers with him growing up, learning everything he'd teach me. A shadow crossed his face. That was a long time ago. What happened? Life. The word was flat, final. People move on, die, disappear. You learn not to hold on too tight to anything. Abigail recognized the walls going up, the shutters closing over whatever pain lived behind that statement. She recognized it because she'd built similar walls herself. Is that why you keep moving? Because you're afraid of holding on? His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and honest beneath the surface calm. Maybe. Or maybe I just hadn't found anything worth staying for yet. The air between them shifted, became charged with something neither of them seemed ready to name. Abigail looked away first, focusing on the horizon where the prairie grass rippled in the breeze like waves on some vast golden ocean. Don't make promises you can't keep, Frank Walker. I've had enough of those to last a lifetime. I'm not promising forever. His voice was quiet, steady. I'm just saying that right now, today, this place feels more like home than anywhere I've been in 3 years. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help you keep it. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders crested the rise. Sheriff Clayton, flanked by 2 of his deputies, all mounted on horses that were too fine for simple law work, and spoke of Clayton's tendency to confiscate evidence that never quite made it back to its rightful owners. Abigail stood slowly, her meal forgotten. Frank rose beside her, his movements unhurried, but his body positioned slightly in front of hers, blocking, protecting. Clayton reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his expression pleasant in the way that poisonous snakes are pleasant right before they strike. Miss Foster, Mr. Walker, beautiful day for ranch work. Sheriff, Abigail kept her voice level. What brings you out here? Just doing my duty. Clayton's gaze moved over Frank with the kind of assessment that cataloged weaknesses and calculated odds. Making sure our new arrival is who he claims to be. Can't be too careful these days. A lot of unsavory characters drifting through, looking for opportunities. Is that right? Frank's tone was mild, but Abigail could feel the tension radiating from him. And what makes you think I'm unsavory? Didn't say you were. Clayton smiled, showing teeth. But a man shows up out of nowhere, claims to be an old family friend, inserts himself into a vulnerable woman's life. Well, that raises questions. Natural questions that a responsible lawman needs to answer. The only question that matters, Abigail cut in sharply, is whether Mr. Walker is employed on my property and whether he has permission to be here. The answer to both is yes, which means unless you have actual legal business, Sheriff, you're trespassing. One of the deputies, young Jimmy Watts, who'd been sweet on the youngest Calloway sisters since they were children, had the grace to look uncomfortable. But Clayton just laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. Spirited. That's what I've always admired about you, Abigail. That fire. His expression hardened. But fire burns, and sometimes it burns the very thing it's trying to protect. Is that a threat? Frank's voice dropped to something dangerous. It's advice. Clayton's hand rested on his gun belt, casual but deliberate. From someone who has Miss Foster's best interests at heart, which is more than I can say for drifters who show up spinning tales and taking advantage of her unfortunate situation. The only person taking advantage, Frank started, but Abigail cut him off with a hand on his arm. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, she said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. But as you can see, I'm perfectly fine. Mr. Walker is an employee, here legally and by my invitation. If that changes, you'll be the first to know. Until then, I'll thank you to respect my property and my choices. Clayton's eyes narrowed, his gaze moving between them, calculating. Your father would be disappointed to see you making such poor decisions. The words hit like a physical blow. Abigail felt Frank tense beside her, felt her own anger surge white-hot behind her ribs. But she kept her voice steady, kept her spine straight, kept her eyes locked on Clayton's with all the defiance she could muster. My father taught me to judge people by their actions, not their badges. He taught me to stand my ground when bullies tried to push me around. And he taught me that the measure of a person isn't what they threaten, but what they protect. She took a step forward off the porch, closing the distance until she stood at Clayton's stirrup, looking up at him with fire in her eyes. So tell me, Sheriff, what are you protecting here? My interests? Or your own? For a moment, something ugly flickered across Clayton's face. Rage, frustration, wounded pride. Then his expression smoothed into professional neutrality, but his eyes remained cold. I'm protecting this town from strangers with unknown pasts who might not be what they seem. I'm protecting a woman who might not realize she's in danger until it's too late. He gathered his reins. But if you want to learn that lesson the hard way, Miss Foster, that's your choice. Just remember, I tried to warn you. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his deputies following. They watched until the three riders disappeared over the rise, leaving nothing but dust and the weight of unspoken threats hanging in the air. Frank let out a long breath. Well, that went about as well as expected. He's not going to let this go. Abigail's hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over. He'll find a way to cause trouble for both of us. Let him try. Frank turned to face her fully. Abigail, I need you to understand something. Whatever's coming, and something is definitely coming, you're not facing it alone anymore. Not as long as I'm here. You barely know me. I know enough. His expression was fierce, protective in a way that made her chest tight. I know you stood up to a man with a badge and a gun and didn't back down. I know you're fighting to keep something your father built, even though the odds are stacked against you. I know you're stronger than half the men I've worked with and braver than most. He paused. And I know that if I walk away now, Clayton will crush you. And I can't, I won't let that happen. Why? The question burst from her before she could contain it. Why do you care? You don't owe me anything. You could ride out of here today and never look back. Why risk Clayton's anger? Why risk whatever trouble is clearly following you? Why stay? Frank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, seeing something she couldn't. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He didn't try to hide. 3 years ago, I watched a man die because I wasn't brave enough to step in when it mattered. Watched him get beaten by men who thought they were above the law, thought they could do whatever they wanted because they had badges and authority and no one to answer to. His hands clenched at his sides. I was just a ranch hand, young, scared, convinced that getting involved would only make things worse. So I stood there, did nothing, and he died. Abigail's breath caught. Frank, I've been running ever since, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to get attached, never letting myself care enough to be vulnerable again. Because caring meant risk. And risk meant possibly failing again, possibly standing by while something terrible happened because I was too afraid to act. He met her eyes, and she saw the weight of guilt and regret and determination burning there. Last night, when I walked into that hall and saw Clayton putting his hands on you, saw the fear in your eyes, I knew I had a choice. I could walk past, keep running, stay safe, or I could step in, risk everything, and maybe, finally, do the right thing. You did do the right thing. I did what I should have done 3 years ago. His voice softened. And standing here now, working beside you, feeling like maybe I'm finally part of something that matters. It's not about obligation, Abigail. It's about redemption. It's about proving to myself that I'm not the coward who stood by and did nothing. It's about finding a place worth fighting for and a person worth protecting and saying, enough. No more running, no more hiding, just standing firm and facing whatever comes. The silence that followed was profound. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. For his pain, for his courage, for the terrible honesty of his confession. I'm not a redemption project, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. No. Frank smiled, sad and genuine. You're a woman trying to save her father's legacy. And I'm a man trying to save his soul. Maybe we can help each other. She should have said no. Should have recognized the danger in tying her fate to someone running from demons she didn't understand. Should have protected herself, her ranch, her heart from the risk of trusting someone who'd already admitted to being broken. But standing there in the afternoon sun, with Clayton's threats still ringing in her ears and Frank's confession still echoing in her heart, Abigail made a different choice. All right, she said, then let's save them both. The rest of the day passed in purposeful work. They moved through tasks with the efficiency of people who'd found a rhythm, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with gestures and glances more than words. By the time the sun started its descent toward the western horizon, they'd accomplished more than Abigail had managed alone in a week. You should stay for dinner, she said, as Frank prepared to ride back to town. The words came out awkward, uncertain. It's not much, just stew and bread, but it's the least I can offer after everything you did today. Frank hesitated, clearly torn between acceptance and propriety. I don't want to compromise your reputation. My reputation was compromised the moment you claimed me at that dance. She managed a tired smile. Besides, we're business partners now. Employer and employee, nothing improper about a working meal. They both knew it was more than that. Knew that whatever was growing between them wasn't simple or safe or easily defined. But Frank nodded, tethered his horse, and followed her into the house. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of simmering stew and fresh bread. Abigail moved through the space with practiced ease, setting out bowls and spoons, pouring water, trying not to notice how Frank's presence filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size and everything to do with the way he made her feel, seen, valued, protected. They ate at the table where her father used to sit, where her mother had served countless meals, where decisions about the ranch and the future had been made for as long as Abigail could remember. It should have felt strange having Frank Walker there, this near stranger who'd inserted himself into her life with lies and promises, but instead it felt right in a way that terrified her. "Tell me about your father," Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What was he like?" Abigail set down her spoon, considering. "Strong, stubborn. He loved this land more than anything except my mother, and when she died, he poured all that love into the ranch and into teaching me everything he knew." Her throat tightened. "He wanted me to marry, wanted grandchildren, wanted what most fathers want, but he also wanted me to be able to stand on my own. Said the world was hard on women, and the only way to survive was to be harder than the world." Sounds like a wise man. He was, until the fever took him. She blinked against the tears that always threatened when she talked about her father. After he died, everything fell apart. The debts he'd hidden to protect me. The enemies he'd made standing up for what was right. The vultures who saw his death as an opportunity. Her hands clenched around her spoon. Clayton started circling before my father was even cold in the ground. Frank reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The touch was gentle, grounding. "You've done an incredible job keeping this place alive. Your father would be proud." Would he? The question came out bitter. "I'm about to lose everything he built, some legacy." "You haven't lost it yet." His grip tightened slightly. "And you're not going to. We're going to find a way." "How? How are we going to come up with enough money to satisfy the bank before they foreclose? Training horses takes months, sometimes years. I don't have that kind of time." Frank was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally he said, "What if we took your best horses to Cheyenne, sold them at the autumn market? Buyers there pay premium prices for quality stock, and you've got quality." Abigail had considered it before, dismissed it as too risky. "That's a 3-week journey each way, 6 weeks away from the ranch, leaving everything vulnerable. And even if we made it there and back safely, there's no guarantee we'd get the prices we need." "It's a risk," Frank admitted, "but it might be your best option. Better than waiting for Clayton to find a legal way to take this place. Better than working yourself to death trying to do everything alone. And who would run the ranch while we're gone? Who'd protect it from Clayton or anyone else who might decide an empty property is ripe for the taking? We'd need help, someone trustworthy to stay behind, keep an eye on things." Abigail laughed, the sound hollow. "Because I have so many trustworthy friends in Silver Creek who'd risk Clayton's anger to help me. Then we find someone from outside town. We hire extra hands, people who don't have a stake in whatever game Clayton's playing." Frank leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Abigail, I know it sounds impossible, but impossible is better than inevitable. Right now, losing this ranch feels inevitable. At least this way we're fighting back." She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that hope and hard work and a well-timed trip to Cheyenne could solve everything. But years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious, to protect herself from the pain of failed dreams. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's enough." Frank squeezed her hand once more before releasing it. "Now, tell me about these horses we'd be taking. What makes them special?" They talked long into the evening, the the conversation flowing from horses to ranching to stories about their pasts that felt safe to share. Frank spoke of cattle drives and dusty trails, of cowboys he'd worked with and places he'd seen. Abigail shared memories of her father's teachings, her mother's quiet strength, the dreams she'd had before responsibility and debt had narrowed her world to simple survival. When Frank finally rose to leave, the moon was high and the night was cool with the promise of stars. He paused at the door, his hat in his hands, his expression serious. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking a chance on a stranger, for trusting me enough to share your table and your story, for letting me be part of this, even for just 2 weeks." "Thank you," Abigail countered, "for stepping between me and Clayton, for offering help when I needed it most, for giving me something I haven't had in a long time." "What's that?" "Hope." The word came out soft, vulnerable, true. "You gave me hope." Frank's smile was gentle, understanding. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek in a touch that lasted only a heartbeat, but felt like a promise. "Then I'll keep giving it to you, every day I'm here. That's a vow, Abigail Foster. Not a promise I can't keep, a vow I won't break." He settled his hat on his head, stepped out into the night, and mounted his buckskin gelding. Abigail stood in the doorway watching him ride away, his silhouette dark against the moonlit prairie, her heart doing complicated things in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine. Behind her, the house stood solid and familiar, filled with memories of people she'd loved and lost. Ahead of her, the future stretched uncertain and dangerous, filled with threats from Clayton and the bank, and the simple, brutal reality of trying to save something that might already be past saving. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Abigail didn't feel alone in facing it. She touched her cheek where Frank's fingers had brushed, then locked the door and climbed the stairs to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new reasons to doubt and fear and question every decision she'd made. But tonight she'd fall asleep with Frank Walker's vow echoing in her mind and hope warming her chest like a candle flame in the darkness. Small, flickering, fragile, but burning nonetheless. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. If normal could include the constant awareness of Sheriff Clayton's scrutiny and the weight of an impossible deadline hanging over everything they did. Frank arrived each morning as the sun crested the horizon, his buckskin gelding picking its way up the road with the ease of familiarity, and he worked beside Abigail until darkness made continuing dangerous. They fixed fences that had sagged under winter's weight, cleared the irrigation ditches that fed the southern pastures, and spent long hours in the corral working with the horses that represented Abigail's last hope of salvation. It was during these sessions that Abigail began to truly understand what Frank brought to her ranch beyond simple labor. He had a gift with horses that went beyond training into something closer to communication. She watched him work with Luna, the 3-year-old mare she'd been struggling to saddle break for months, and saw the young horse respond to him with a trust she'd never shown Abigail. Frank moved slowly, spoke softly, never forced or rushed, and somehow convinced Luna that the saddle wasn't a threat, but an invitation to partnership. "How do you do that?" Abigail asked on the 5th morning, leaning against the corral fence as Frank guided Luna through her paces, the mare finally accepting the weight of a rider without the panic that had marked every previous attempt. Frank glanced over, his hands steady on the reins, his seat relaxed in the saddle. "Do what?" "Make it look easy. I've been working with her for 3 months, and she's never been this calm." He brought Luna to a halt, patted her neck with obvious affection. "You were trying to break her will. I'm trying to earn her trust. There's a difference." He dismounted, ran his hand down Luna's shoulder. "Horses are like people. You can force them to do what you want through fear and dominance. Or you can show them that cooperation benefits everyone. One method is faster. The other builds something that lasts." Abigail climbed over the fence, approaching Luna slowly. The mare's ears swiveled toward her, but didn't pin back in warning. "Progress. My father used to say something similar. He said the best horses were partners, not tools." "Your father was right." Frank handed her the reins. "Try her now. But remember, you're not fighting her. You're dancing with her." The next hour was a revelation. With Frank's guidance, Abigail discovered that Luna's resistance hadn't been stubbornness but fear, and that fear dissolved when approached with patience instead of frustration. By the time they finished, both woman and horse were tired but triumphant, and Abigail felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the knot of anxiety that had lived there since her father's death, a glimpse of possibility where there'd been only dread. "Thank you," she said as they led Luna back to her stall. "Not just for this, but for everything. For staying, for helping, for—" She hesitated, then forced the words out. "For not making me feel foolish for needing help." Frank stopped walking, turned to face her fully. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that fell through the barn's open door, and his eyes were impossibly blue in the golden light. "Asking for help isn't weakness, Abigail. It's wisdom. It's knowing that some loads are too heavy to carry alone, and that there's no shame in sharing the weight." His voice dropped, became something more intimate. "And for what it's worth, you've helped me too. Given me a reason to stop running. A place that feels like it could become home if I let it." The air between them grew charged with awareness, with possibility, with all the things they hadn't said but both felt growing stronger. Each day they worked side by side. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something she couldn't name and wasn't sure she wanted to resist. Then Luna snorted, breaking the moment, and they both laughed, awkward, relieved, still circling whatever was building between them, but not yet ready to name it aloud. The spell was broken further by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Frank's expression shifted instantly from warm to wary, his body positioning itself between Abigail and the barn door. But the rider who appeared wasn't Clayton or his deputies. It was Tommy Chen, the 16-year-old son of Silver Creek's doctor, his young face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Miss Foster!" He reined in his horse so abruptly the animal nearly sat back on its haunches. "Miss Foster, you need to come quick. There's trouble in town." Abigail's stomach dropped. "What kind of trouble?" "Sheriff Clayton arrested Sam Miller on horse theft charges. Says Sam stole one of the horses from the Henderson Ranch last week, and he's got proof." Tommy's words tumbled over each other in his haste. "But Miss Foster, everyone knows Sam didn't do it. He was helping my father deliver Mrs. Patterson's baby that night, was at our house until dawn. My father's willing to testify, but Clayton won't listen. Says his evidence is solid and Sam's going to hang if he can't prove his innocence." Frank swore softly. Abigail's mind raced, connecting pieces she didn't want to fit together. Sam Miller was a farmhand who worked for several families around Silver Creek, a quiet man in his 30s who'd never caused trouble and had a wife and 2 young children depending on his wages. He was also one of the few people in town who'd spoken kindly to Abigail after her father's death, who'd helped her with heavy work when he had time and never asked for more than fair payment. "What's the evidence?" Frank asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A witness says they saw Sam near the Henderson place that night, and Clayton says he found stolen tack in Sam's barn with Henderson's mark on it." Tommy looked between them, his young face troubled. "But, Miss Foster, Sam's barn door doesn't even lock. Anyone could have put that tack there. And the witness, it's Jake Morrison, and everyone knows Jake owes Clayton money and would say whatever Clayton wanted him to say." "This is about me." The words came out flat, certain. Abigail looked at Frank, saw the same realization in his eyes. "Clayton's making an example, showing what happens to people who help me, who stand with me against him." Frank's jaw clenched. "He's using the law as a weapon. That's what men like him do." Abigail was already moving, heading for the barn to saddle Duchess. "Tommy, ride ahead and tell your father we're coming. Tell him not to let anyone move Sam until we get there." "Yes, ma'am." The boy wheeled his horse and took off at a gallop, leaving dust and urgency in his wake. Frank caught Abigail's arm as she reached for her saddle. This could be a trap. Clayton might be expecting exactly this. You riding into town, getting involved, giving him an excuse to come after you next. "I know." She pulled free gently but firmly. "But Sam helped me when he didn't have to. His children played with me when I was young and he was just starting out. I can't let him hang for a crime he didn't commit just because helping me made him a target." "Then we both go." Frank was already saddling his buckskin. "And we're careful. No confrontations, no accusations we can't prove. We play this smart." They rode hard toward Silver Creek, the afternoon sun beating down on their backs, both of them silent with their own thoughts. Abigail's mind churned through possibilities, searching for a way to help Sam that wouldn't make things worse. Clayton held all the power in this situation: the badge, the authority, the willingness to bend the law to suit his purposes. What did she have? Nothing but the truth. And truth had a way of mattering less than people wanted to believe when power and politics were involved. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon, its buildings sharp against the pale sky. They slowed their horses as they entered the main street, drawing curious stares from townspeople who'd clearly heard about Sam's arrest and were lingering to see what would happen next. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of the street, its windows reflecting the afternoon light like closed eyes. Dr. Chen met them on the wooden sidewalk outside, his weathered face drawn with worry. He was a small man, older than Abigail's father would have been, with the gentle hands of a healer and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much suffering. "Miss Foster, Mr. Walker, thank you for coming. How is Sam?" Abigail dismounted, tying Duchess to the hitching post. "Scared. His wife is inside with him now, but Clayton's only giving her a few minutes." Dr. Chen glanced at the office door. "I've told Clayton I'll testify that Sam was with me that night, but he says witness testimony isn't enough to override physical evidence and an eyewitness account. The evidence he conveniently found and the witness who conveniently owes him favors." Frank's voice was cold. "That's not justice. That's corruption." "Careful, Mr. Walker." Dr. Chen's tone held warning. "Clayton has friends on the territorial judge's circuit. Speaking against him without proof won't help Sam. It'll just make you the next target." "I'm already a target." Frank looked at Abigail. "We both are. This is just Clayton's way of tightening the noose." The office door opened and Sam's wife emerged, her face streaked with tears, her two children clinging to her skirts. She was younger than Abigail, barely 25, with the worn look of someone who'd married for love and found hardship instead. When she saw Abigail, something broke in her expression. Hope and desperation tangled together. "Miss Foster, please. Sam didn't do this. You know he didn't. He's a good man, a good father. We can't—" Her voice cracked. "We can't lose him. Please." Abigail took the woman's hands, felt them trembling. "I know, Martha. I know Sam didn't do this, and we're going to prove it." "How?" The question came out raw, hopeless. "Clayton has evidence, has a witness, has the law on his side. What do we have?" "The truth." The word sounded hollow even to Abigail's own ears, but she forced conviction into her voice. "And people willing to fight for it." Martha's eyes filled with fresh tears. She squeezed Abigail's hands once, hard, then gathered her children and hurried away, probably heading home to wait for news that might never come or might come in the worst possible form. Frank touched Abigail's shoulder. "We need to see Sam, talk to him, understand exactly what happened." "Clayton won't let us." Abigail stared at the office door, at the barrier between them and the truth. "Not without cause." "Then we give him cause." Frank straightened his shoulders, settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I'll tell him I'm concerned about the safety of Miss Foster's property, given that there's a horse thief operating in the area, that I want to know what precautions law-abiding citizens should take. He'll see right through that. Probably, but he'll let us in anyway, because turning us away would look like he's hiding something. And Clayton's smart enough to know that appearances matter." Frank's expression hardened. "He wants to intimidate us." "Fine. Let's give him a chance to try." They entered the sheriff's office together, stepping from bright afternoon sunlight into the dim interior that smelled of old coffee, leather, and the stale sweat of fear. Clayton sat behind his desk, looking entirely too satisfied with himself, while one of his deputies, the older one, Marcus Webb, who had a reputation for being Clayton's most loyal enforcer, lounged against the wall cleaning his nails with a knife. Clayton's eyebrows rose when he saw them. "Well, Miss Foster and her faithful employee, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "We heard about Sam Miller's arrest." Abigail kept her voice neutral, professional. "Given that I run a horse ranch, I'm concerned about this horse thief you've apparently caught. I'd like to know the details so I can protect my property." "How civic-minded of you." Clayton leaned back in his chair, his smile sharp. "Though I'd think your new hired hand would be protection enough." Unless, of course, he's not as trustworthy as you believe. Frank's voice was carefully controlled. I'm trustworthy enough to tell Miss Foster when something doesn't add up, like a horse theft conviction based on evidence that appeared conveniently after the accused was targeted. Targeted? Clayton's tone turned dangerous. That's a serious accusation, Walker. You suggesting I planted evidence? I'm suggesting that evidence needs to be verifiable, that witnesses need to be credible, and that in my experience, when everything lines up too perfectly, it's usually because someone arranged it that way. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Deputy Webb stopped cleaning his nails, his hand moving to rest on his gun. Abigail stepped slightly forward, putting herself between Frank and whatever violence might be brewing. Sheriff, all we're asking is to understand the facts. Sam Miller has worked for half the families in this county. His reputation is solid. If he's guilty, the evidence will prove it fairly. But if there's any chance he's innocent, don't you think he deserves a thorough investigation rather than a rush to judgment? Clayton stood slowly. His height and bulk meant to intimidate. You know what your problem is, Miss Foster? You think being your father's daughter gives you the right to question how I do my job. You think that ranch of yours, that failing, debt-ridden piece of property you're about to lose, somehow makes you important enough to challenge a duly appointed officer of the law. He moved around the desk, each step deliberate. But here's the truth. Your father's dead. His influence died with him. And that ranch? It'll be under new ownership before summer's over. So maybe instead of worrying about horse thieves and investigations, you should worry about your own situation. Is that why you arrested Sam? The words burst from Abigail before caution could stop them. To remind me how powerless I am? To show everyone in Silver Creek what happens to people who help me? I arrested Sam Miller because he's a horse thief. Clayton's voice dropped to something cold and final. And if you continue to interfere with my investigation, I'll have grounds to arrest you for obstruction of justice. Is that what you want? To sit in a cell next to your friend while your precious ranch sits empty and vulnerable? Frank moved then, his body language shifting from controlled to dangerous in an instant. You threaten her again, badge or no badge, and we're going to have a problem that has nothing to do with the law. Webb pushed off the wall, his hand closing around his gun. The air crackled with the potential for violence, for everything to spiral out of control in ways that would help no one and hurt everyone. Enough! Dr. Chen's voice came from the doorway, where he'd apparently been listening. He stepped inside, his presence somehow commanding despite his small stature. Sheriff Clayton, I've known you since you were a boy causing trouble at the schoolhouse, and I've known Sam Miller for 15 years. One of you is lying about what happened that night, and I have a professional obligation to determine which. He held up a leather-bound journal. This is my logbook. It documents every birth, every patient visit, every medical call I've made for the past 20 years. And on the night in question, it clearly shows that Sam Miller was at my home from 10 in the evening until 6 the next morning, assisting with a difficult birth. Mrs. Patterson will confirm it. The midwife will confirm it. Sam's presence is documented and witnessed by multiple credible sources. Clayton's expression flickered just for a moment, with something that might have been uncertainty or might have been calculation. That doesn't explain how Henderson's tack ended up in his barn. No, it doesn't. Dr. Chen's tone was sharp, which suggests someone put it there deliberately, which suggests this isn't a legitimate arrest, but a frame job. And while I respect your authority, Sheriff, I won't stand by and watch an innocent man hang because you have some other agenda. The silence that followed was profound. Abigail could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Frank's tension radiating beside her, could sense that this moment balanced on a knife's edge and could fall either toward justice or disaster. Finally, Clayton sat back down, his expression smoothing into professional neutrality. Fine. I'll review the evidence again, talk to Henderson, verify the timeline with your midwife. But Sam stays locked up until I'm satisfied. His eyes fixed on Abigail. And you stay out of my investigation, all of you. This is official law business and interference won't be tolerated. It wasn't exoneration, wasn't even really a concession, but it was enough to keep Sam alive a little longer, to give them time to find proof that might save him. Thank you, Sheriff. Dr. Chen inclined his head slightly. I trust you'll conduct a thorough and fair investigation. They left the office together, stepping back into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the dimness inside. Abigail's legs felt shaky, her hands trembling with adrenaline and anger. Frank's hand found the small of her back, steadying her. "That was brave," he said quietly. "Probably foolish, but brave." It wasn't enough. She looked down the street to where Martha Miller had disappeared with her children. Sam's still locked up, Clayton's still in control, and we're no closer to proving what really happened. "But we bought time." Dr. Chen closed his journal carefully. "And time is what we need to find the real thief and expose whoever planted that evidence." "How?" Abigail felt exhaustion crashing over her. "Clayton controls the investigation. Any evidence we find, he can dismiss or discredit. Then we find evidence so compelling, he can't dismiss it." Frank's voice held determination. "We talk to Henderson, find out exactly what was stolen and when. We find other people who might have seen something that night. We build a case so solid that even Clayton can't ignore it. That could take weeks. Sam doesn't have weeks. Then we work fast." Frank looked at Dr. Chen. "Can you keep Clayton honest? Make sure he doesn't rush this through before we have a chance to investigate?" "I can try. My testimony alone won't free Sam, but it'll raise enough doubt to slow the process." The old doctor's expression was grim. "But be careful, both of you. Clayton's dangerous when cornered, and you just backed him into a corner in front of witnesses." They parted ways with promises to share any information they uncovered. Frank and Abigail rode slowly out of town, both silent with the weight of what had just happened and what still needed to be done. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the prairie stretched endless and empty around them. "He's not going to stop," Abigail said finally, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "Clayton, he's going to keep coming after me, after anyone who helps me, until I give up or he finds a way to take everything." "I know. So what do we do?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon, his expression distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady with decision. "We fight. Not just to save Sam, though that's part of it. We fight to save your ranch, your future, everything your father built. And we do it by taking the offensive instead of just defending." "What do you mean?" "Your horses. The best ones. Luna, that bay gelding with the perfect conformation, the roan mare that moves like poetry. We take them to Cheyenne like I suggested. We get the money to pay off your debts, secure your property, take away Clayton's leverage." He turned to look at her fully. "We stop reacting to his moves and make some moves of our own. And leave the ranch vulnerable while we're gone? Leave Sam locked up? Leave Martha and her children to face whatever Clayton does next? We hire people to stay behind. People from outside Silver Creek who don't owe Clayton anything. We make sure the ranch is protected and that someone's keeping an eye on Sam's situation." His voice turned urgent. "Abigail, staying here and trying to defend against every attack isn't working. Clayton has too much power, too much control. The only way to beat him is to change the game entirely." She wanted to argue, to find the flaws in his plan, to protect herself from the hope that was trying to take root despite everything. But deep down, she knew he was right. Defense wasn't enough, not against someone as ruthless and patient as Clayton. "When?" The question came out steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Soon. Within the week if we can manage it. The autumn market doesn't wait, and every day we delay is another day Clayton has to tighten his grip." They rode the rest of the way in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the ranch, the familiar sight of her father's buildings against the darkening sky made Abigail's throat tight. This place was everything, her past, her present, the only future she could imagine. Risking it on a desperate journey to Cheyenne felt like tempting fate, but losing it slowly to Clayton's machinations while she did nothing felt worse. Frank helped her stable the horses, their movements synchronized from days of working together. As they finished, he turned to her in the soft twilight that filled the barn, dust motes floating in the last rays of sun that slanted through the open door. "I know I'm asking a lot," he said, "asking you to trust me, to take this risk, to bet everything on a plan that might not work. But I swear to you, Abigail, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you don't regret it." She looked at him, this man who'd walked into her life with lies and stayed with truth, who'd stood between her and danger without hesitation, who somehow made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the world alone. I know you will. She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body after a long day's work. And that terrifies me more than Clayton ever could. Why? Because trusting you means risking more than just my ranch. It means risking, she faltered, unable to name what she felt growing between them, unable to voice the fear that admitting it would make her too vulnerable. Frank's hand rose slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, his fingers brushed her cheek with a gentleness that made her chest ache. I know. I feel it too. This thing between us that's more than employer and employee, more than friends helping each other. Something that could be wonderful or disastrous depending on how we handle it. So how do we handle it? Carefully. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Honestly, by acknowledging it exists but not letting it cloud our judgment or distract us from what needs to be done. He smiled, sad and warm. And by accepting that sometimes the biggest risk is the one most worth taking. Abigail's breath caught. She should step back, preserve the professional distance that was the only thing keeping her from falling completely for a man who might still disappear as suddenly as he'd arrived. Should protect her heart the way she'd learned to protect everything else, by building walls and refusing to need anyone. But standing there in the golden twilight with Frank's hand warm against her face and his eyes holding promises she wanted desperately to believe, she found she couldn't make herself step away. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief, tentative, nothing like the passionate embraces described in the dime novels Martha sometimes loaned her. Just a soft press of lips, lasting only heartbeats, conveying everything words couldn't express about hope and fear and the terrible courage it took to trust someone with your heart when your world was falling apart. When she pulled back, Frank's expression held wonder and something deeper that made her stomach flutter. Abigail, don't. She pressed her fingers to his lips, forestalling whatever he might say. Don't make promises. Don't say things we can't take back. Just stay. Help me save this place. And when it's over, when we know if we've won or lost, then we'll figure out what this is between us. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm that felt like a vow. When we've won. Not if. When. That night, long after Frank had ridden back to town and the ranch was dark and silent, Abigail stood at her bedroom window looking out at the moonlit prairie. Tomorrow they'd begin planning the journey to Cheyenne. They'd hire the hands they needed, select the horses they'd take, map the route that might save or ruin everything. They'd do all the practical, necessary things that survival demanded. But tonight, she let herself feel the lingering warmth of Frank's kiss, the weight of his hand on her cheek, the promise in his eyes that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who saw her not as a burden or a conquest, but as a partner worth fighting beside. The dawn would bring new challenges, Clayton's retaliation, Sam's uncertain fate, the impossible task of organizing a journey that could make or break her future. But for now, in the quiet darkness, Abigail Foster allowed herself to feel something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. Real, genuine, terrifying hope. And somewhere in the night, she suspected Frank Walker was feeling exactly the same thing. The preparations for Cheyenne consumed the next 3 days in a blur of activity that left little time for doubt or second-guessing. Frank proved his worth tenfold, riding out to neighboring counties to hire hands willing to stay behind and protect the ranch while they were gone. He returned with 2 men, brothers named Jack and Peter Cordell, who'd worked cattle drives across 3 territories and had reputations solid enough that even their references spoke of them with respect. They were weathered men in their 40s, quiet and competent, and they asked no questions about why a woman would leave her property in the hands of strangers to chase premium prices in Cheyenne. "We've worked for worse causes," Jack said simply when Abigail expressed her gratitude. "And Frank vouches for you. That's enough." They also brought news that made Abigail's blood run cold. Sam Miller's trial had been scheduled for 2 weeks hence, barely enough time for due process, let alone a proper investigation. Clayton was pushing hard, clearly intent on making his example before anyone could build a strong enough defense. Dr. Chen had filed formal protests, had even traveled to the territorial capital to speak with the circuit judge. But bureaucracy moves slow, and Clayton's influence ran deep. "We need to move faster," Frank said on the third evening as they finalized their plans. They sat at Abigail's kitchen table, maps spread between them, Luna and 3 other horses selected for the journey. If we leave at first light tomorrow, we can make Cheyenne in under 3 weeks if we push hard. Sell the horses, get back before Sam's trial, use the money to secure your ranch and hire the best lawyer available. That's asking a lot of the horses. Abigail traced the route with her finger, calculating distances and water sources. And of us? I know. But we're out of time for careful plans. Frank's expression was grim. Clayton's moving fast because he knows we're onto him. If we don't act now, we'll lose Sam, and he'll use that momentum to come after you next. Abigail knew he was right, but fear still clawed at her throat. What if we fail? What if the horses don't bring enough money, or we can't make it back in time, or then we fail fighting instead of fail waiting? Frank reached across the table, his hand closing over hers. But we're not going to fail, Abigail. I won't let that happen. His certainty should have seemed like empty bravado. Instead, it felt like bedrock, solid, dependable, something she could build on. She squeezed his hand once, drawing strength from his touch, then pulled away before the warmth of his skin against hers could make her forget all the practical concerns demanding attention. All right, dawn tomorrow. We take Luna, the bay gelding, the roan mare, and that young stallion my father bought the year before he died. 4 horses, 3 riders counting young Danny Warren, who Frank says can handle the remuda. Danny was 16, the son of a rancher 2 counties over, and by all accounts a responsible young man who knew his way around horses and wouldn't ask questions about the urgency of their journey. He'd arrived before dawn with his own mount and provisions enough for the trail. They spent the rest of the evening checking tack, organizing supplies, doing all the mundane tasks that expeditions required. The Cordell brothers would move into the small bunkhouse behind the barn, would maintain the property and keep watch for any trouble Clayton might send their way. Dr. Chen had promised to send word if Sam's situation changed, using his son Tommy as a courier since the boy was quick and trustworthy. Everything was arranged, everything was ready. And yet Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that some crucial detail had slipped past their attention and would come back to haunt them when they could least afford it. She was crossing from the barn to the house near midnight, Frank having finally ridden back to town to collect his own gear, when she smelled it. Smoke. Faint but distinct, carried on the night breeze from somewhere north of the house. Her heart stopped, then kicked into overdrive as she ran toward the smell, praying she was wrong, praying it was just a neighbor burning brush or a campfire or anything except what her gut told her it was. The north pasture was on fire. Not one fire. 3 separate blazes, deliberately set and strategically placed to drive the horses toward the fence line where they'd panic and hurt themselves trying to escape. In the moonlight, she could see flames licking at the dry grass, spreading fast with the wind, and hear the terrified screaming of horses who smelled smoke and knew instinctively that fire meant death. "Jack! Peter!" Her voice ripped from her throat in a scream that carried across the property. "Fire! North pasture!" She was already running, not toward safety, but toward danger, toward the horses that represented everything she had left. Behind her, she heard the bunkhouse door slam open, heard the brothers shouting to each other as they mobilized. But there was no time to wait, no time to organize. Every second counted. The pasture gate was closed, but not locked. She'd been meaning to fix the latch for weeks and never found time. Now that negligence might save her horses' lives. She threw it open and plunged into the smoke-filled darkness, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning, her entire focus narrowed to finding her animals before the fire did. Luna was closest, rearing and screaming her terror, her eyes rolling white in the firelight. Abigail grabbed her halter, spoke in the most soothing tone she could manage, while her own heart hammered with panic. "Easy, girl, easy. I've got you. Come on now, this way." Getting Luna through the gate took precious minutes. The mare fought every step, driven by instinct to run anywhere but toward the human trying to guide her. But finally, they cleared the opening and Abigail could turn her loose to gallop toward the safer southern pastures. 4 more horses remained inside. The fire was spreading faster now, fed by wind and dry grass, creating a wall of heat and light that made the night bright as noon and twice as hellish. Jack and Peter appeared through the smoke, leading 2 horses between them, their faces blackened with soot. 2 more inside, Abigail shouted over the roar of flames. The stallion and the old mare. It's too dangerous. Jack grabbed her arm as she turned back toward the fire. The fence line's about to go. If those horses are still in there, then I'm getting them out. She jerked free, covering her mouth with her sleeve, and plunged back into the inferno. The heat was tremendous, stealing the breath from her lungs and the moisture from her eyes. She could barely see through the smoke and tears, could barely hear over the crackling roar of burning grass and the screaming of panicked animals. The old mare, Duchess, who'd pulled her wagon to the social just days ago, stood frozen in the corner, too frightened to move. The young stallion was nowhere visible, probably already dead or fled or lost in the chaos. Duchess! Abigail reached the mare, grabbed her halter with hands that trembled from adrenaline and fear. Come on, old girl, move, please move. The mare's eyes found hers, seemed to recognize something human in all the chaos. She took one step, then another, following Abigail toward where the gate should be if they hadn't gotten turned around in the smoke. Each step felt like walking through molasses, time stretching and contracting strangely, the world reduced to heat and smoke and the desperate need to survive. They were halfway to safety when the fence line caught with a whoosh that sent flames shooting 10 feet high. The path they'd used to enter was now blocked by a wall of fire that made escape impossible. Duchess screamed and reared, nearly pulling Abigail off her feet. They were trapped, cut off from the gate, the flames closing in on all sides. Abigail's mind raced through options and found none. They couldn't go forward, couldn't go back. The fire was too high to jump, too wide to run through. In minutes, maybe less, the entire pasture would be consumed and them with it. She was going to die here, going to burn to death trying to save a horse while her father's ranch went up in flames around her. Clayton had won, had destroyed everything just like he'd threatened, and she'd walked right into it. Then she heard hoofbeats pounding through the smoke, heard a voice she'd know anywhere shouting her name. Abigail, where are you? Here! She screamed the word with everything she had left. Frank, I'm here! He materialized through the smoke like something out of a fever dream, mounted on his buckskin, his face grim with determination and fear. He didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, just rode straight for the fence line at a gallop, his horse gathering itself and launching over the flames in a jump that should have been impossible and somehow wasn't. They landed hard on the other side, Frank fighting to keep his seat as the buckskin stumbled. Then he was beside her, reaching down with one arm. Give me your hand, now. Duchess is a horse. You're a person. Give me your damn hand. She grabbed it, felt his fingers lock around her wrist with bruising strength as he hauled her up behind him. The buckskin grunted under the double weight, but didn't hesitate when Frank wheeled him toward the one section of fence that wasn't yet fully engulfed. Duchess followed, her fear of fire momentarily overcome by her herd instinct to stay with the other horses. Hold on! Frank didn't wait for confirmation, just sent his horse charging toward the flames. Abigail buried her face against his back, felt his muscles coil with tension, felt the moment of suspension as the buckskin gathered and jumped, and for one impossible heartbeat, they were airborne above fire and smoke and death. They landed clear. Behind them, Duchess crashed through a weakened section of fence, her momentum and panic carrying her to safety even as burning rails collapsed in her wake. The pasture behind them was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like the fingers of some hungry god. Frank didn't stop until they'd reached the barn, where Jack and Peter had already organized a bucket brigade from the well to wet down the buildings closest to the fire. He slid from his horse and pulled Abigail down with him, his hands running over her frantically, checking for injuries with a desperation that made her chest tight. Are you hurt? Burned? Tell me you're not burned. I'm fine. Her voice came out hoarse from smoke inhalation. Frank, I'm fine. You got there in time. In time? His voice cracked. I got there with seconds to spare. If I'd been any later, he couldn't finish the sentence, just pulled her against his chest, so hard she felt his heart hammering against her cheek. Don't ever do that again. Don't ever risk your life for a horse again. Do you understand me? They're all I have. The words came out muffled against his shirt. The ranch, the horses, it's everything my father left me. I couldn't just let them burn. You could have died. His arms tightened around her. And what good is your father's legacy if you're dead? What's the point of saving anything if you're not alive to enjoy it? She had no answer to that, could only stand there in his embrace while the fire burned itself out in the north pasture and the Cordell brothers worked to keep it from spreading further. Could only feel the aftermath of terror making her legs weak and her hands shake and her chest ache with emotions she couldn't name. Eventually, Frank released her enough to look at her face, his thumb brushing soot from her cheek. This was deliberate. 3 separate fires, perfectly placed to cause maximum damage. Clayton. Or someone acting on his orders. Frank's expression turned murderous. He's done being subtle, done with threats and pressure. Now he's actively trying to destroy you. We can't prove it was him. Well, we don't have to prove it. We just have to understand what it means. Frank glanced toward the burning pasture, his jaw set. It means we're out of time. It means we leave tonight, right now, before he can make another move. Tonight? Abigail's exhausted mind struggled to process. But we're not ready. Danny hasn't arrived yet. The horses need rest. We need to get out of here before Clayton burns the rest of your ranch to the ground. Frank's voice was hard with conviction. He set those fires to destroy your stock, your livelihood, your hope. He failed tonight because we were lucky and fast and willing to risk everything to save what matters. But he'll try again, Abigail, and next time we might not be so lucky. Jack approached, his face streaked with soot and sweat. Fires contained. Pasture's a loss, but the buildings are safe. We got lucky with the wind direction. He looked between them, reading the situation with the quick intelligence of someone who'd survived by staying alert. You're thinking of leaving tonight? Yes. Frank didn't look away from Abigail. Can you handle things here alone until we can send Danny from town? We can handle whatever comes. Jack's voice held conviction. But you need to know. Whoever set those fires will know you're leaving once you hit the trail. They'll either try to stop you before you get far, or they'll hit this place even harder while you're gone. Then make sure they can't. Frank finally looked at the older man. Protect this ranch like it's your own. Keep watch day and night. Trust no one from town, especially anyone claiming to come from the sheriff. And if Clayton himself shows up, you tell him Miss Foster is away on business and you have orders to shoot trespassers. That'll make us criminals in his eyes. Better criminals than victims. Frank's expression was fierce. I'll send word once we're clear. In the meantime, keep this place standing. That's all I ask. Jack nodded once, then returned to help his brother finish securing the property. Frank turned back to Abigail, his hands settling on her shoulders. We're leaving in 1 hour. Enough time to wash the worst of the smoke off, grab what we can carry, saddle the horses we're taking. Everything else stays behind. Abigail wanted to argue, wanted to insist on proper preparation, on waiting for dawn, on all the sensible, careful things she'd been doing since her father died. But standing there with her north pasture still smoldering and Frank's hands warm on her shoulders and the memory of nearly dying still fresh in her mind, she found she didn't have the energy for caution anymore. 1 hour, she agreed. But Frank, those fires. You said you'd return to town to get your gear. What made you come back? His expression turned grim. Instinct. I was at the livery stable saddling up when I got this feeling, like something was wrong, like I needed to be here. So I rode out fast as I could. He paused. When I crested that rise and saw the fire, saw the flames, and knew you were somewhere in the middle of it. His voice cracked. I've never been so terrified in my life. She reached up, her hand covering his where it rested on her shoulder. You saved me. Saved Duchess. Saved everything. This time. His thumb stroked across her collarbone. But Abigail, I need you to understand something. Where we're going, what we're about to do, it's dangerous. Not just the trail and the weather and the normal risks of travel. Clayton won't let us just ride away with your best stock. He'll either try to stop us or he'll use our absence to cement his claim on your property. Either way, we're walking into a situation where we might lose everything. I know. And you're willing to risk it anyway? She thought of her father, of the dreams he'd had for this ranch and the legacy he'd died protecting. Thought of Sam Miller sitting in a jail cell for a crime he didn't commit, his family suffering because he'd been kind to her. Thought of Martha and her children, of Dr. Chen's tired eyes, of every person in Silver Creek who'd been hurt by Clayton's ambition and corruption. And she thought of Frank Walker, this stranger who'd walked into her life with lies and stayed with truth, who'd pulled her from fire and promised to stand beside her no matter what came. "I'm willing to risk everything," she said quietly, "because the alternative is losing it anyway while doing nothing. At least this way we're fighting back." Frank's smile was fierce and proud. "Then let's make that bastard regret the day he decided to come after you." They moved through the next hour in controlled chaos. Abigail washed quickly, changed into her sturdiest riding clothes, packed a small bag with essentials and the documents proving her ownership of the ranch and the horses. Frank saddled their mounts and the 4 horses they'd take to Cheyenne, checking every strap and buckle with the attention of someone who knew that details meant the difference between survival and disaster. The Cordell brothers helped load supplies, food, water, blankets, a small tent that would provide minimal shelter from weather. They worked in the darkness before dawn, speaking little, moving with the efficiency of people who understood that time was both precious and running out. "Miss Foster," Peter approached as she was securing her bedroll behind her saddle, "I want you to know, whatever happens here, whatever Clayton tries, we'll keep your ranch standing. You have my word." "Thank you." The gratitude felt inadequate for what these men were risking. "I know you're putting yourselves in danger for a stranger. I won't forget that." "You're not a stranger. You're Frank Walker's friend, and Frank's a good man. That's enough." Peter glanced toward where Frank was checking Luna's hooves one final time. "He cares about you, you know, more than just as an employer or a friend. I've known him 3 years, worked beside him on 2 separate drives. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Abigail's throat tightened. "I care about him too, but right now caring feels like a luxury I can't afford. There's too much at stake, too much that could go wrong." "That's exactly when caring matters most." Peter's weathered face creased in a slight smile. "When everything's easy, caring is simple. It's when things are hard that you learn what someone's really made of. Frank's proved what he's made of. Now you get to prove the same." Before she could respond, Frank called out that they were ready. Abigail swung into her saddle, feeling the familiar comfort of leather and the solid presence of Duchess beneath her. Around her, the ranch stood dark and quiet, buildings silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Everything her father had built and everything she'd fought to keep. She might never see it again, might lose it all while chasing a desperate hope across 3 weeks of hard trail. But she'd lose it standing still anyway, so at least this way she'd go down fighting. "Ready?" Frank brought his buckskin alongside Duchess, his expression serious in the faint light. "As I'll ever be." "Then let's ride." They set out as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, 4 horses on lead ropes trailing behind them, the Cordell brothers watching from the yard until darkness swallowed the sight of them. The trail to Cheyenne stretched ahead, 3 weeks of unknown territory and certain hardship, with everything Abigail owned and everyone she cared about hanging in the balance. The first 2 days passed in a blur of constant movement. They rode hard, pushing the horses as much as they dared, covering ground that would normally take 3 days in just 2. Frank set a brutal pace, clearly determined to put as much distance between them and Silver Creek as possible before Clayton realized they were gone and potentially tried to stop them. They spoke little during the daylight hours, saving their breath and energy for the work of travel. But at night, when they'd made camp and the horses were tended and they sat by a small fire beneath a sky full of stars, the walls between them began to crumble. "Tell me what happened 3 years ago." Abigail's voice broke the comfortable silence on their 3rd night out. "You mentioned watching a man die because you didn't step in. What happened?" Frank was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "His name was David Martinez. He worked for the same ranch I did, outside of Abilene. Quiet man, kept to himself, did his job, and did it well." He stared into the fire, seeing something other than flames. "The ranch owner's son, kid named Marcus, had a mean streak. Liked to push people around, especially the Mexican hands who couldn't complain without risking their jobs. David pushed back one day when Marcus got too rough with one of the younger workers. And Marcus didn't like that. Marcus got his friends, all ranch owners' sons, all convinced they were above consequences. They waited until David was alone in town, then beat him bloody in an alley behind the saloon." Frank's hands clenched. I was there, saw it start, saw David go down. And I stood there telling myself it wasn't my fight, that getting involved would just get me fired or worse. You were scared. I was a coward. The words came out harsh, self-condemning. David died 2 days later from internal bleeding. The local sheriff, who was Marcus's uncle, ruled it an accident. Said David had been drunk and fell. Everyone knew the truth, but no one said anything because the ranch owner had too much power and crossing him meant losing your livelihood. Abigail reached across the space between them, her hand finding his. You were young and alone and facing people with all the power. That's not cowardice. That's survival. It felt like cowardice. Still feels like it. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. I left that ranch the next day. Started moving, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments, never letting myself care enough about anything to risk facing that choice again. He met her eyes across the firelight. Until I walked into that social and saw Clayton putting his hands on you, and suddenly I had to choose, walk past like I did with David, or step in and damn the consequences. I'm glad you chose to step in. So am I. His thumb stroked across her knuckles. Because knowing you, fighting beside you, having something worth protecting again, it's given me back something I thought I'd lost that night in Abilene. Purpose. Direction. A reason to stop running. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks spiraling up toward the infinite stars. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and the horses shifted restlessly in their picket, but Abigail barely noticed any of it, too focused on the man across from her and the vulnerability in his eyes. What happens after? She asked quietly. After we sell the horses and return home and hopefully save everything we're trying to save. What happens to us? What do you want to happen? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Abigail thought about the kiss they'd shared in the barn, about the way her heart jumped every time she saw him riding up to the ranch, about the comfort of working beside someone who understood without needing explanations. I want you to stay, she said, the words coming out barely above a whisper, not just as a hired hand or a temporary solution. I want you to stay because you want to, because this place feels like home, because, she faltered, afraid to voice the rest. Because of us. Frank finished the sentence for her. Because what's growing between us is worth nurturing, worth seeing where it leads. Yes. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating at once. But I'm also scared. Scared of trusting someone this much. Scared of losing you the way I've lost everyone else. Scared that I'm reading this all wrong and you're just being kind. Frank released her hand, but only long enough to move around the fire and settle beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders and pulling her against his side. You're not reading it wrong, and I'm not just being kind. His voice was low, rough with emotion. Abigail Foster, I fell for you the moment I saw you standing in that corner with your blank dance card and your proud spine and your refusal to let Clayton win. Every day since then, I've fallen a little harder, and the thought of leaving you, of going back to that empty life of moving from place to place with nothing to anchor me, it's unbearable. She tilted her head back to look at him, seeing the truth written in his expression. So stay. When this is over, when we've won or lost or found some middle ground, stay with me. Help me rebuild. Be my partner in more than just saving the ranch. Is that a proposal, Miss Foster? His tone held gentle teasing, but his eyes were serious. It's an invitation. To see where this leads. To take the risk of caring even when the world's falling apart around us. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. To choose hope over fear. Frank's response was to kiss her, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. His lips claimed hers with a fierce tenderness that spoke of all the loneliness they'd both endured and all the connection they'd found in each other. Abigail melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her heart racing as the kiss deepened and the rest of the world fell away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. When we get back, he said quietly, when your ranch is secured and Sam is free and Clayton is dealt with, I'm going to court you properly. Take you to socials, bring you flowers, ask your permission for every kiss. I'm going to do this right. You are doing it right. She smiled against his lips. You saved my life, Frank Walker. You stood between me and disaster without knowing me, without expecting anything in return. That's more romantic than 1,000 flowers. Even so, he pulled back slightly, his expression serious. You deserve courtship. Deserve someone who treats you like you're precious, not just convenient. And once this crisis is over, I'm going to show you exactly how precious you are to me. They sat together as the fire burned down to embers, talking quietly about futures that might never come and dreams that felt impossibly distant. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them and they settled into their respective bedrolls, the space between them feeling both too wide and exactly appropriate given the uncertainty of everything ahead. The journey continued. They crossed rivers swollen with spring runoff, traversed high passes where the wind cut like knives and the air was too thin to breathe comfortably, rode through valleys so beautiful they ached and wastelands so desolate they despaired. The horses held up well, their quality evident in their endurance and spirits. Luna in particular proved herself worth every hour Abigail had invested in her training, moving with grace and power that would surely catch a buyer's eye. They were 2 weeks out from Silver Creek when they reached the territory of the real dangers, not weather or terrain, but human predators who saw travelers as opportunities. Frank's vigilance increased, his hand never far from his rifle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats. On their 15th night, those threats materialized. They'd made camp in a box canyon that offered protection from wind and good grazing for the horses. Abigail was tending the fire while Frank checked the animals one final time before full dark. She heard his sharp whistle, their agreed-upon signal for danger, and looked up to see 3 riders silhouetted against the dying light at the canyon's entrance. Her blood turned to ice. Even at this distance, even in the failing light, she recognized the lead rider's build, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse with arrogant confidence. Sheriff Clayton had found them, and judging by the men flanking him and the weapons they carried, he hadn't ridden all this way just to talk. Frank appeared at Abigail's side so quickly she barely saw him move, his rifle already in his hands, his body positioned between her and the 3 riders. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that spoke of a man who'd faced violence before and survived it. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." Clayton urged his horse forward into the canyon. His 2 companions, deputies from Silver Creek, both men known for following orders without questioning their legality, flanking him with weapons drawn. In the fading light, Clayton's smile was visible even at this distance, cold and triumphant. "Miss Foster, Mr. Walker," Clayton's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You've led us on quite a chase, 2 weeks tracking you across some of the most unforgiving country in the territory. I hope whatever you're running toward is worth it." "We're not running." Abigail stepped out from behind Frank despite his warning, her spine straight, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "We're conducting legitimate business, taking horses to market in Cheyenne." "Is that what you call it?" Clayton dismounted, his movements deliberate, theatrical. "Because from where I stand, it looks like fleeing, abandoning your property, leaving in the middle of the night after setting fires to cover your escape, taking valuable livestock that might be needed as collateral for your outstanding debts. The only person who set those fires was you." Frank's rifle remained level, pointed directly at Clayton's chest. "We have witnesses who will testify to that." "Witnesses?" Clayton's laugh was genuine, amused. "You mean the Cordell brothers? 2 drifters with questionable pasts who'd say anything for the right price. Or perhaps Dr. Chen, whose testimony about Sam Miller's whereabouts is looking increasingly unreliable, given new evidence that surfaced." Abigail's stomach dropped. "What new evidence?" "Seems the good doctor's logbook has some interesting discrepancies, pages that might have been altered, dates that don't quite match other records." Clayton's smile widened. "Makes a man wonder what else he might be lying about to protect his friends." "You fabricated evidence against Dr. Chen." The realization came out flat, certain. "Just like you fabricated evidence against Sam. Just like you're fabricating reasons to be here now." "I'm here on official business." Clayton's hand moved to rest on his gun belt. "Pursuing a suspect who fled jurisdiction while under investigation for arson and theft. That's well within my authority as a law enforcement officer." "Your authority ends at the county line." Frank's voice was hard as granite. "Which we crossed 10 days ago. You have no jurisdiction here, Clayton. No legal right to detain us or seize our property. Then I'll just have to convince you to return voluntarily. Clayton's expression shifted, became something uglier. Or I could simply report to the territorial marshal that I encountered two fugitives who resisted arrest and were unfortunately killed in the resulting altercation. That's what happens to people who point rifles at duly appointed sheriffs. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Abigail felt fear turn her blood to ice, but she forced herself to think, to find the angle that might save them. Clayton had ridden for 2 weeks to find them, which meant he was desperate. Desperate men made mistakes, and desperate men could sometimes be reasoned with if you understood what they really wanted. "You didn't come all this way just to arrest us," she said, her mind working rapidly. "You came because you need to stop us from reaching Cheyenne. Need to prevent us from selling these horses and getting the money that would clear my debts and remove your leverage over my property." Clayton's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been grudging respect. "Always were a clever girl, Abigail. Your father's daughter through and through, too smart for your own good. Smart enough to know that killing us would create problems even you couldn't smooth over. Frank's friends know where we are. The Cordells would testify about the fires, about your harassment. Dr. Chen would add his voice. And territorial marshals don't look kindly on sheriffs who execute people outside their jurisdiction. Accidents happen on the trail." Clayton shrugged, but his eyes remained calculating. Falls, animal attacks, tragic misunderstandings. The wilderness has a way of making problems disappear. So does the truth. Frank's rifle never wavered. And the truth is, you want Abigail's ranch so badly, you're willing to commit murder to get it. Question is why? What makes that particular piece of land worth all this effort? For the first time, uncertainty crossed Clayton's face. His jaw worked like he was chewing through options, weighing what to reveal against what to hide. Finally, he said, "That land sits on top of one of the richest water sources in 3 counties. Underground river that could irrigate thousands of acres, support a town 3 times Silver Creek's size. The railroad's coming through in 2 years, and whoever controls that water will control the entire region's development." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Abigail's father had always said their water rights were valuable, but she'd never understood just how valuable. "You've been planning this for years, waiting for my father to die, positioning yourself to seize the property the moment I became vulnerable. Your father was stubborn, refused every offer, every reasonable proposal. But you," Clayton's smile returned, cold and possessive, "you're young, alone, drowning in debt. Should have been easy to convince you to sell or to simply foreclose when you couldn't pay, but then Walker showed up and complicated everything. So you arrested Sam to make an example, set fires to destroy my stock, followed us all the way out here to make sure we couldn't raise the money to save the ranch." Abigail's voice shook with fury. "You've destroyed lives, corrupted the law, and committed crimes across multiple territories, all for water rights and railroad money. I've done what's necessary to secure my future." Clayton's expression hardened. "And I'm not letting some horse rancher's daughter and her drifter boyfriend stand in my way. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over your property to me, right now, willingly and legally. In exchange, I'll let you both ride away alive. You can start over somewhere else, build a new life, and forget Silver Creek ever existed." "And if we refuse?" Frank's question was quiet, dangerous. "Then I'll kill him first while you watch." Clayton's gun was suddenly in his hand, pointed at Frank. "Make it slow enough that you'll do anything to make it stop, including signing whatever I put in front of you. Then I'll kill you anyway, take the horses, and tell everyone back home that you both died tragically on the trail. It's not my preferred option, too messy, too many potential complications, but I'm prepared to do it if necessary." Abigail's mind raced. They were trapped in a box canyon with 3 armed men blocking the only exit. Frank was skilled, but he couldn't shoot all 3 before one of them returned fire. Running would leave them exposed and accomplish nothing except possibly getting the horses killed in the crossfire. Fighting seemed impossible. Surrendering seemed worse. Unless she could buy time. Unless she could stall long enough for an opportunity to present itself. "Let me see the papers." Her voice came out remarkably steady given the circumstances. "If I'm signing away everything my father built, I want to read what I'm agreeing to." Clayton's smile widened, victorious. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, clearly prepared in advance for exactly this scenario. "Smart girl, making the practical choice. Frank's head turned sharply toward her, his expression shocked and betrayed. Abigail, you can't. It's my ranch, Frank, my choice. She held his gaze, trying to convey with her eyes what she couldn't say aloud. Trust me. Play along. Be ready. I won't let you die for a piece of land, no matter how much it means to me. She saw the moment he understood, saw his body tense with readiness, even as his expression remained devastated. He lowered his rifle slightly, not enough to be completely vulnerable, but enough to suggest defeat. Clayton approached, document extended, his confidence growing with each step. I knew you'd see reason eventually. Women usually do when faced with real consequences. He was within arm's reach now, close enough that Abigail could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the greed burning in his eyes. She reached for the document. Her fingers closed around it. And then, with every ounce of strength she possessed, she yanked hard, pulling Clayton off balance and directly into the path of Frank's rifle. Everything happened in the space of heartbeats. Frank's rifle swung up, not firing but slamming into Clayton's jaw with a crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Clayton staggered backward, his gun firing wild, the shot going high and wide. The two deputies reacted instantly, going for their weapons, but Frank had already moved, using Clayton's body as a shield while Abigail dove for cover behind a boulder. "Drop your weapons!" Frank's voice rang with authority, with the promise of violence barely contained. "I've got your sheriff, and I will put a bullet through him if you make me. Drop them now!" The deputies hesitated, clearly weighing their loyalty against their survival. Clayton groaned, blood streaming from his split lip, his eyes unfocused from the blow. The standoff held for 3 seconds, 5, 10. Each moment stretched taut as a wire about to snap. Then horses thundered into the canyon from the direction opposite the one Clayton had entered. 5 riders, moving fast, and at their head rode a face that made Abigail's heart leap with recognition and hope. Jack Cordell and his brother, accompanied by 3 other men wearing territorial marshal badges, descended on the scene like the cavalry in a dime novel. They surrounded Clayton's deputies, weapons drawn, faces grim with purpose. Sheriff Clayton. The lead marshal was a weathered man in his 50s with hard eyes and a harder voice. "I'm Marshal William Dawes, Territorial Authority. You're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, attempted murder, and about 15 other charges that'll be detailed when we get you to the Capitol." Clayton's face went white, then red with fury. "You have no authority to arrest me. I'm a duly appointed—" "You're a criminal who thought his badge would protect him from consequences." Dawes dismounted, producing iron shackles that looked like they'd seen considerable use. "But the Territorial Governor's Office has been investigating complaints about Silver Creek for 6 months. We finally got enough evidence to move when the Cordell brothers sent word about the fires and your pursuit of Miss Foster beyond your jurisdiction." Abigail emerged from behind the boulder, her legs shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. "How did you know we'd be here?" "We didn't." Jack's weathered face creased in a tired smile. "But Frank sent word through a Pony Express rider about your route and timeline. When Clayton left Silver Creek in pursuit, we figured he'd catch up to you somewhere along this stretch. Been riding hard for 4 days to get here before things went completely wrong." 4 days. Frank lowered his rifle finally, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "You rode 4 days without stopping?" "Would have ridden 8 if we had to." Peter moved to help the marshals secure Clayton and his deputies. "Nobody threatens our friends and gets away with it." The next hour passed in a blur of explanations and legal procedures. Marshal Dawes had brought documentation of their investigation, including testimony from citizens in Silver Creek who'd been too afraid to speak up while Clayton was in power, but were willing to testify now that territorial authority was involved. Sam Miller had been released 2 days earlier when one of Clayton's own deputies, young Jimmy Watts, whose conscience had finally overridden his fear, confessed to planning the stolen tack in Sam's barn on Clayton's orders. Dr. Chen's testimony stood unchallenged, the attempted frame-up exposed for the desperate fabrication it was. And the Territorial Governor's Office had already been investigating the railroad's attempts to acquire water rights through questionable means, making Clayton's schemes part of a larger pattern of corruption that reached far beyond Silver Creek. "You'll need to return for the trial," Dawes explained as his men prepared to transport Clayton back to the Capitol. "Your testimony about the fires and this attempted coercion will be crucial to securing convictions." "What about my ranch?" Abigail felt fear clutch at her heart despite everything. The debts, the foreclosure date, the governor's office has frozen all proceedings related to your property pending the outcome of the investigation. Given Clayton's involvement in pressuring creditors and manipulating the legal system, there's grounds to review every debt and lien filed against your ranch in the past year. Dawes's expression softened slightly. You'll still owe money, Miss Foster, but you'll owe it to legitimate creditors on legitimate terms, not to vultures like Clayton who were using the law as a weapon. Relief flooded through her so powerfully her knees went weak. Frank's arm came around her waist, steadying her, and she leaned into his strength gratefully. Clayton, shackled and defeated, looked at them with pure hatred burning in his eyes. This isn't over. I have friends, influence. You think one investigation will... Your friends are facing their own investigations. Dawes cut him off coldly. Your influence died the moment we gathered enough evidence to move. And as for this being over, for you, it very much is. You'll spend the next 20 years in territorial prison if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, if the judge decides your crimes warrant it, you'll hang. They dragged him away, his protests fading into the darkness beyond the canyon. The deputies went quietly, both clearly relieved that they'd been caught before doing something they couldn't take back. Within minutes, the canyon was peaceful again, just Abigail and Frank and the Cordell brothers and the infinite stars overhead. Thank you. Abigail looked at Jack and Peter, her voice thick with emotion. For riding day and night to save us, for protecting the ranch, for being the kind of men who keep their word even when it's dangerous. Like I said before, you're Frank's friend. That makes you our friend. Jack tipped his hat. Besides, taking down corrupt lawmen is satisfying work. We might make it a habit. They stayed another hour, sharing what little food remained and catching each other up on everything that had happened in Silver Creek during Abigail's absence. Sam Miller was back with his family, his reputation not only restored, but enhanced by the revelation of Clayton's corruption. Martha and her children were safe and grateful. Dr. Chen had been instrumental in organizing testimony against Clayton, rallying the town's decent citizens to finally stand up against the tyranny they'd endured for years. And the Foster Ranch stood exactly as Abigail had left it, protected by the Cordells and waiting for her return. What about Cheyenne? Frank asked as the Cordells prepared to ride back with the marshals. We're still a week out. The horses still need to be sold. The autumn market doesn't close for another 3 weeks. Jack glanced at the 4 horses picketed nearby, their quality evident even in moonlight. You've got time to make the sale and get back before anyone misses you. And I'd wager those animals will fetch even better prices now that your ranch's reputation isn't tied to false debt and corruption charges. So they rode on to Cheyenne, just the 2 of them now, the urgency replaced by something closer to anticipation. The remaining week passed in easy companionship, conversations flowing freely without the weight of fear hanging over every word. They talked about everything and nothing, childhoods and dreams, losses and hopes, the small details that built understanding between 2 people learning to trust each other completely. Cheyenne rose from the plains like a promise kept, its buildings sprawling along the rail line, its auction yards filled with buyers from across the west. Frank had been right about the prices. Luna alone brought in enough money to clear half of Abigail's legitimate debts, and the other 3 horses together covered the rest with substantial surplus remaining for improvements and security. The buyers were impressed by the quality of her stock, several expressing interest in future purchases. One, a rancher from California with operations across 3 states, offered to contract with her for trained horses at premium prices, guaranteeing income for years to come if she could maintain her father's standards. Standing in that auction yard with money in her hands and a future suddenly stretching open before her, Abigail felt tears streak down her face. Frank pulled her into his arms, letting her cry out all the fear and stress and desperate hope of the past months, his embrace solid and safe and exactly where she needed to be. He'd be proud of you, Frank murmured into her hair. Your father. He'd be so damn proud of how you fought to save his legacy. I couldn't have done it without you. She pulled back to look at his face, this man who'd walked into her life with lies and stayed with truth, who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved. Frank Walker, you gave me back my life. How do I ever repay that? You don't repay it. His thumbs brushed tears from her cheeks. You live it. You rebuild your ranch, train your horses, prove that good people can win against corruption and greed. And if you're willing, he paused, his expression turning vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. If you're willing, you let me be part of that life. Not as a hired hand or a temporary solution, but as a partner. As someone who wants to stand beside you for whatever comes next. Is this that proper courtship you promised? Her smile felt shaky but real. Because if so, you're doing it backwards. Usually the courtship comes before the declarations of partnership. Usually the courtship doesn't involve fires and gunfights and cross-territory chases. Frank's smile matched hers, warm and genuine. We've done everything backwards, Abigail. Met under false pretenses, built trust in crisis, fell in love while running for our lives. Why start being conventional now? Her breath caught. Love? Love. The word came out certain, unafraid. I love you, Abigail Foster. Love your strength, your courage, your stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed impossible. Love the way you care for your horses and your friends and your father's memory. Love who you are and who you make me want to be. He took her hands, his grip warm and steady. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that love to you every single day. Abigail had spent so long being careful, being practical, protecting herself from the pain of loss and disappointment. But standing there in the Cheyenne auction yard with Frank's eyes holding promises he clearly intended to keep, she found she was done being careful. Yes, the word burst from her, joyous and certain. Yes, I'll have you. Yes, I love you too. Yes to partnership and courtship and whatever future we can build together. Just yes. Frank's kiss tasted like victory and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared hope for. Around them, the auction yard continued its business, buyers and sellers negotiating futures, but Abigail barely noticed. She was too busy kissing the man she loved and feeling, for the first time since her father's death, that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. They returned to Silver Creek 3 weeks after they'd left, riding in at dawn on a morning that painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. The town was already awake and buzzing with news of Clayton's arrest and the territorial investigation. People emerged from buildings to watch them pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to respect to outright gratitude. Sam Miller stood outside the general store with his wife and children, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw them. "Miss Foster, Mr. Walker, welcome home." The words hit Abigail with unexpected force. Home. Silver Creek was home again, not a place of threats and fear, but a community that had finally found the courage to stand against corruption. She reined in Duchess, returning Sam's smile with genuine warmth. "How are you, Sam? Your family?" "We're good. Real good, thanks to you." Martha stepped forward, her children clinging shyly to her skirts. "Dr. Chen told us how you stood up to Clayton, how you helped expose his crimes. We won't forget that, Miss Foster. None of us will." More people emerged. The Calloway sisters, old Mrs. Patterson, Tommy Chen on his way to the doctor's office. They called out greetings, congratulations, thanks for helping break Clayton's hold on their town. And Abigail realized that somewhere in the chaos of the past weeks, she'd stopped being the lonely rancher's daughter with the blank dance card and become someone these people respected, someone they'd stand with when it mattered. The Foster Ranch appeared on the horizon like a benediction, its buildings solid against the morning sky, smoke rising from the bunkhouse where the Cordells were clearly already awake and working. As Abigail and Frank rode into the yard, both brothers emerged with smiles that spoke of a job well done and relief at seeing them safely returned. "Everything's just as you left it," Jack reported. "No trouble after the marshals took Clayton. Actually, several folks from town came by offering to help with repairs and improvements once word got out about what you'd been fighting against." "The North Pasture?" Abigail almost didn't want to ask, didn't want to see the destruction the fires had caused. "Already replanted. Community came together, brought seed grass, worked the burned sections until they were ready for new growth. Should be good grazing again by late summer." Peter's weathered face creased in satisfaction. "Turns out, when people aren't terrified of their sheriff, They're pretty eager to help their neighbors. Tears threatened again, but Abigail blinked them back. There would be time for tears later, happy ones, grateful ones, tears of relief that the nightmare was finally over. For now, she had a ranch to reclaim and a future to start building. The Cordell brothers stayed another week, helping Frank and Abigail establish routines and make plans for expansion. With the money from Cheyenne and the prospect of contracted sales to the California rancher, Abigail could afford to hire additional hands, purchase new breeding stock, and invest in the improvements her father had always dreamed of but never had resources to implement. On their last night at the ranch, the brothers joined Abigail and Frank for dinner around the kitchen table that was starting to feel less like a reminder of loss and more like a promise of new traditions being built. "You going to make an honest woman of her?" Jack asked Frank directly, the kind of blunt question that came from men who'd seen enough of life to dispense with subtlety. Frank glanced at Abigail, his expression both amused and serious. "When she'll have me. But I figure she's earned the right to a proper courtship first. Flowers, socials, time to be sure this is what she wants without crisis forcing the decision. This is what I want." Abigail reached across the table, her hand finding Frank's. "Crisis didn't create what we have, it just revealed it faster than might have happened otherwise. And I don't need a long courtship to know you're the best thing that's ever walked into my life." "Even so," Frank laced his fingers through hers, "you deserve to be courted like you're precious. Because you are. To me, to this community, to everyone whose life you've touched by refusing to give up." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "So I'm going to court you properly, Abigail Foster. I'm going to take you to the next social and dance every dance with you. I'm going to bring you flowers from the prairie and tell you every single day how remarkable you are. And when enough time has passed that you're absolutely certain, I'm going to ask you to marry me in front of the whole town so everyone knows that the woman I love chose me just as surely as I chose her." Peter chuckled. "That's the most words I've ever heard you string together at once, Frank Walker. She must really be something special." "She is." Frank's eyes never left Abigail's face. "She absolutely is." The months that followed were the happiest of Abigail's life. Frank moved into the ranch house, properly, with approval from Dr. Chen serving as unofficial community elder and enough propriety observed to keep the gossips at bay. They worked side by side, rebuilding what Clayton had tried to destroy, training horses that quickly gained a reputation for quality that reached far beyond Silver Creek. True to his word, Frank courted her with a dedication that was both touching and slightly comical. He brought her wildflowers every morning. He accompanied her to socials where they danced until the musicians begged for mercy. He asked permission before every kiss as if she were some delicate thing that might break, despite having seen her ride through fire and face down corrupt lawmen without flinching. And slowly, carefully, they built something neither had expected to find. A partnership based on equality and respect, a love grounded in shared values and tested by fire, a future that stretched ahead bright with possibility. Clayton's trial concluded with convictions on all charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in territorial prison, a punishment severe enough to send a message about corruption, but just short of execution. Several of his co-conspirators received similar sentences. The railroad's attempts to manipulate land acquisitions were thoroughly investigated, resulting in reformed regulations and protections for property owners across the territory. Sam Miller received official exoneration and compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. Dr. Chen was honored by the Territorial Medical Board for his role in exposing corruption. And the Foster Ranch became the premier horse training operation in 3 counties, its reputation for quality and integrity drawing buyers from across the West. 6 months after their return from Cheyenne, on a clear autumn evening when the prairie grass rippled like gold beneath a sky full of stars, Frank Walker took Abigail Foster to the exact spot where he'd first ridden onto her property at dawn all those months ago. "This is where it started," he said, dismounting and helping her down from Duchess, "where I first saw your ranch and thought maybe, just maybe, I'd found a place worth stopping for." "And now?" Abigail looked around at the land that was finally fully hers. No debts, no threats, no shadows hanging over its future. "Now I know for certain." Frank took both her hands, his expression serious and tender. "Abigail Foster, You are the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You saved your father's legacy, saved your community from corruption, and somehow managed to save a broken cowboy who thought he'd never find home again. He dropped to one knee, and Abigail's breath caught in her throat. I love you more than I thought it possible to love anyone. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life standing beside you, facing whatever comes, building a future worthy of everything you fought to protect. Will you marry me? The answer came without hesitation, without doubt, without any of the careful protection she'd wrapped around her heart for so long. Yes. Yes, Frank Walker. I'll marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Just yes. He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. When he finally set her down, his kiss was deep and thorough and full of promises about their wedding night that made her blush and laugh simultaneously. Soon, she said when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Let's get married soon. I'm tired of propriety and courting and sleeping in separate rooms. I want you as my husband, officially and completely. Next month. Frank's grin was wide and genuine. We'll have the wedding at the church in town, invite everyone, and then spend a week in Cheyenne celebrating. How does that sound? Perfect. She pulled him close again, resting her head against his chest and listening to his heartbeat. It sounds absolutely perfect. They married on a crisp November morning with the entire town of Silver Creek in attendance. Sam Miller gave Abigail away in her father's absence, his eyes bright with tears of gratitude and joy. Martha and the Calloway sisters served as attendants, all of them wearing new dresses and smiles that spoke of genuine happiness. Dr. Chen performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, speaking about love tested by fire and partnerships built on mutual respect and courage. And when Frank kissed his bride, when Abigail Foster became Abigail Walker in front of everyone who'd watched her fight and struggle and ultimately triumph, the cheering could be heard clear across the prairie. The reception lasted until well past midnight, with dancing and food and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. The Cordell brothers had returned for the occasion, bringing with them stories of their own adventures and promises to visit whenever they passed through the territory. Tommy Chen gave a speech about bravery that made everyone cry. Even old Mrs. Patterson danced, her husband swinging her around like they were young again. But eventually, the celebration wound down. Frank and Abigail slipped away to the ranch house that was now officially theirs, not hers alone or his by courtesy, but theirs together. They stood on the porch, looking out at the moonlit prairie, at the horses moving peacefully in the pastures, at the land that had been worth fighting for and the future they'd built together through courage and determination and love. Happy? Frank asked, his arm around her waist, pulling her close against the evening chill. Happier than I ever thought possible. Abigail leaned into his warmth, feeling safe and cherished, and exactly where she belonged. 6 months ago, I was standing alone at a social with a blank dance card, thinking I'd face everything by myself. And then you walked through those doors and changed my entire life. She's taken, Frank murmured, echoing the words that had started everything. That's what I said that night, and I meant it. From that moment on, you were taken, protected, valued, claimed by someone who saw your worth when others saw only vulnerability. And now? Now you're taken for good. He turned her in his arms, his hands cradling her face, his eyes holding promises about the wedding night ahead and the lifetime beyond it. Taken by choice, by love, by the kind of partnership that weathers every storm and comes out stronger. You're mine, Abigail Walker, and I'm yours, for good. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and full of gratitude for the cowboy who'd said she was taken when she was anything but, who'd stood beside her through fire and fear and impossible odds, who'd given her back not just her ranch, but her faith in the possibility of love and partnership and happily ever after. The Foster Ranch thrived under their joint management, becoming known across the West for quality horses and honest dealing. Frank and Abigail trained their stock together, managed their business together, built a life together that honored the past while embracing the future. Children came eventually, 3 of them, each raised with the values their parents had fought so hard to preserve: courage, integrity, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep and the prairie stretched endless beneath the stars, Frank and Abigail would sit on their porch and remember the night everything changed. The night a stranger walked through the doors of a social and claimed a lonely woman with two simple words. The night that fear became hope and solitude became partnership and a blank dance card became the beginning of a love story that would last a lifetime. She was taken. Had been from that first dance, that first kiss, that first moment when Frank Walker's blue eyes met hers and promised protection without demanding surrender. Taken by choice, by love, by the kind of connection that transformed two broken people into something stronger together than either could have been alone. Taken, claimed, cherished, and loved. For good. For always. Forever. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the horses moved peacefully in their pastures and the ranch stood solid against whatever the future might bring, Abigail Walker rested in her husband's arms and knew with absolute certainty that every struggle, every fear, every impossible moment had been worth it for this, for love, for partnership, for the life they'd built together from ashes and hope and the courage to believe in second chances. The cowboy had said she was taken. And in every way that mattered, in every way that would last, she was.